The story of Lebanon starts, like all my favorite stories, in a time before time. It's a world that few of us would recognize. Stone spears and painted caves, waves of humanity moving with the seasons like a tide, a land without owners. And it's in that void of memory where 1,000 generations would rise and fall. Heroes and cultures and gods that would never be recorded. Lives that for all eternity would echo too quiet for us to ever hear. But around 11,000 years ago, all of that would change. To the south of these mountains, people would begin to claim land as their own. They would fight and die to let others feel that truth. It was those precious few who would begin to farm for what we currently believe to be the first time anywhere on this planet. We don't know exactly why they did it, granted. That's just another echo too quiet for us to hear. But no matter the reason, for those who staked their claim long enough, this fertile crescent would come to provide them with a cornucopia of grain. Rye, emmer, einkorn, barley, lentils, vetch, chickpeas, flax. It would provide them with creatures strong enough to suffer their burdens, and yet somehow still willing to hear their commands. It would give them power that those wandering men of the forest could never hope to beat. And soon every inch of this land would become someone's commodity, some dirt worth dying for. And just like that, the people who'd roamed these mountains for so many hundreds of thousands of years would disappear. But with every action comes a reaction. And from those farms came storehouses, and from the storehouses, bandits. From the bandits came walls, then towns, then rivals. Each stalk of grain growing like a spear yearning for war. It wasn't just a change of diet, it was a complete overhaul of how humans were meant to live their lives, like a fire burning away all that wild that had come before. And it's from that ash that rose a phoenix. Here in Byblos, there's evidence of a year-round settlement starting at least 10,800 years ago. It's one of the oldest permanent settlements yet found anywhere on this planet. It has been inhabited without interruption for no less than the last 7,500 years. To put that into context, the last time people weren't living in this town was 2,000 years before the invention of writing. But for the sake of brevity, let's start at 3000 BC, where this region would be inhabited by a people who might well have called themselves Canaanites. Or at the very least, that's what their neighbors might have called them, although there's still a bit of a debate to that word. It probably meant low, although some people suggest it might have meant subjugated, which would presumably therefore be reference to their people existing in subjugation to the first dynasty of Egypt, but more likely it probably meant low as in lowlands, or specifically, the land below these hills. It would have been a way to differentiate them from the people of Lebanon, an Akkadian word meaning white. Or, I suppose more accurately, this specific mountain of white. It's the great Mount Lebanon that separates Syria from the Mediterranean coast. It's also, naturally, where the modern country of Lebanon got its name. So although nobody can say for certain, according to the earliest records that humans ever made, it would not be unthinkable that the people of Canaan would have referred to those of this valley, while Lebanon were those of the hills. But regardless of their names, from the perspective of the empires who conquered them, neither were all that special. They were one people, those who existed in subjugation to provide resources for a land that none of them had ever known. And none of those resources would be nearly as important as these trees. This exact forest would become one of the most important pieces of human civilization from the very beginning, stretching all the way up to our modern day. The first recordings we have of Lebanon are not from its people themselves, but from those who came to steal these trees. We call them the Sumerians. And thousands of years ago, in that very first civilization that dawned on this planet, a poem was written about a king named Gilgamesh. And in that poem, they spoke of this great forest, a land where their king defeated the demon Humbaba and was granted all his sacred trees. Having conquered their people, that foreign ruler would take those sacred trees and use them to build a ship that could handle the mighty Euphrates, as well as a gate for his ceremonial city Nippur. Which in itself spoke of their great value, as not only were city entrances in Sumerian culture of huge religious and spiritual significance, but within that fledgling empire, Nippur was considered the truest center of the cosmos. It was the seat that provided their king his power. So for this wood to be the foundation of that city was no less than calling it the foundation of the universe itself. It is no stretch to say that the roots of human civilization as we know it reach back to this exact forest. But the first would not be the last. These trees would be mentioned by Sargon of Akkad. They were used in the ziggurat at Ur. Virtually all mummifications would have included at least some of this wood. In the kingdom of Kemet, now known as ancient Egypt, the first patches of papyrus on which some of the earliest forms of hieroglyphics would be recorded would be done so with this cedar's sap. Their great palatial temples and colossal city entrances, just as with those Sumerians before them, would rely on the cedars of Lebanon. It was fundamental in building the greatest palaces and temples that up until then our world had ever known. But even more than that, it would also allow for those empires to rise through trade, because starting at least 3,500 years ago, those godlike pharaohs would build their own personal ships out of these trees. Ships that eventually would let Egypt conquer the River Nile and the Mediterranean beyond. The most important ships of Egyptian history would be colloquially known as Byblos, after this Lebanese city that made them. As Egypt itself had little in the way of forests, access to reliable timber would have been absolutely vital in maintaining their growing imperial power. And although other options were available through Africa, India, and elsewhere in their deep trade network, the Lebanese cedar was simply one of a kind. Because although many trees have their own unique values, this specific cedar is special. It's softer than oak, which makes it more flexible, and yet it remains just as strong. It's easy to shape into curved forms, like that of a ship's hull, and yet through its overabundance of sap has a natural resistance to both rot and the common parasites that often ruin lumber. Which naturally, in the ancient world, with little in the way of chemical coating, this would have been considered a very big deal. To this day, there are many examples of this lumber having survived for thousands of years without rotting. And with its flexibility, not to mention its straight trunk, it could be used to create masts that could bend rather than snap, allowing for sails that could handle the harsh winds of the deep Mediterranean, allowing sailors to go further, faster, and safer than ever before. It was, simply put, the perfect wood to make a ship out of. Certainly the best that any culture that ever rose out of the Middle East would have encountered, at least. To those Egyptians who controlled these people of Lebanon, accessing those cedars would have been as fundamental as oil is to a country today. They were the gates of the cosmos, and they meant nothing less than control of the sea. And yet just as they took, so too did they provide. And as the ancient cultures of Sumer, Babylon, Adam, and the pharaohs each came to harvest that prize, they would leave behind a little bit of what had made them so successful. Their technologies, ideas, immigrants, and eventually even their gods would send shockwaves through these ancient coastal towns, spurring their economies and cultures alongside. As their trade grew, so too did their importance. So too did their value to those great empires of the world. And before long, these little cities of Canaan would become some of the most important, not just in this region, but on the entire planet. Especially after all of their neighbors died. We don't really know why the Bronze Age collapsed, or if that's even really an accurate way to describe the events of that era, but what we do know is that Lebanon is a phoenix. And for whatever reason, around 1200 BC, virtually every major civilization in the Near East was all but completely destroyed. The Greeks, Hittites, Assyrians, and to a lesser extent Egyptians were all brought to their knees by a group we now nebulously call the Sea Peoples. Although it's safe to say that it was surely much more complicated than that. But with access to those trees and now no overlord to demand them, the people of Lebanon were able to create their own ships that would allow them to dominate the trade of the Mediterranean. Outposts once built by the Minoans, Greeks, Hittites, and Egyptians would now be filled with Canaanite Lebanese. And yet even in their greatest success, these were still not a united people. Rather, they were a series of competing city-states, each with their own kings and cults and networks and rivalries. If you asked someone what they were, they would tell you the city that they were most connected to. They would say they were Tyrian or Aswadian or Beirusian, but from the outside looking in, these were one people, one culture. They were the people of the trees. And so I suppose it's only natural that their Egyptian customers would eventually start to refer to them that way. They were the carpenters. And that would be reflected in that language of the pharaohs as funhwa. Within a few generations of that Bronze Age collapse, and they would use their unbeatable ships to make themselves the center of a nearly unprecedented trade network. Within just a few hundred years, and these once subjugated cities would become among the wealthiest the world had ever known, the world's leaders in luxury goods. That Lebanese brand would become synonymous with the best of the best, the highest prices, the fanciest things. With access to tin and copper, they'd make bronze. With wood for their fires, they'd produce glass, something that at the time was one of the world's rarest and most expensive commodities. They'd eventually even smelt iron, combining resources that were only accessible to them thanks to their deep trade network. And yet that said, from a European historical perspective, and therefore generally what people of that background believe today, the most important product that they ever made was an ink. Made from an incomprehensible number of glands of an endemic snail, those Canaanites began producing a form of ink we call the royal purple. In the ancient world, this color of ink was almost invaluable. Purple was not an easy color to obtain. In fact, you could even say it was a virtually impossible color to obtain. It would take the killing of thousands of this region's endemic snails just to produce a tiny vial of this ink. A robe in this color would cost more than a house, certainly more than a life. It was an extreme luxury good, and since the European monarchies would have far less reliance on the lumber of the Near East, that meant that those great cities of Canaan would eventually become more well known for that dye than they were their cedar, and soon enough, those growing civilizations of Europe would name them for it. The Greek word for that specific color of purple would be borrowed from the Egyptian name of the people who produced it, funhwa, although they'd pronounce it phoenix, and from there we'd get the name Phoenician. Over the next 500 years, those rival cities of purple carpenters would dominate the trade of the Mediterranean. With their great masts of bendable cedar, they would expand their reach further than virtually any civilization who'd come before. Their trade networks would not only allow for cultural exchanges between long-standing enemies, but direct access to commodities, all but impossible for other societies to achieve. Their sailors would rule outposts as far as southern Spain, perhaps as far even as the Azores, although that's yet to be truly confirmed. Some even say they were able to round the southern Cape of Africa, circling the entire continent and returning through the mouth of Gibraltar years later. We don't know if that's actually true, granted, but if it was because of these trees. They were the most traveled and internationally minded people on Earth. Every good idea happening in Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, or the Middle East, they would get to take as their own. And so, as the center of the cosmos yet again, their cities would prosper. The culture of Phoenicia would go on to become a quiet backbone of nearly all European civilizations. Thousands of years later, and that legacy still lingers all across that continent. It backs their alphabets. Their eyes of protection still watch over the ports. They gave Greece not only their pantheon, but also much of their ancient culture. A culture that would be imitated by Rome, and in turn, the many nations that would split off from that great empire. But the larger the storehouses, the more likely you get bandits. and small, decentralized cities with little in the way of manpower. As they overflowed with wealth, eventually those imperial tributes just weren't enough. With the collapse of the Bronze Age now far in the rear view, those rebounding giants began to covet what the people of Lebanon had created, and alongside those invading horsemen rode in an apocalypse. In the 800s came the Assyrians, returning to finish the job in the 7s. They were followed by the Babylonians in the 600s and the Persians in the 5s. But it was in 332 BC, through the arrival of that great conqueror of Macedon, where the final nail was put into the hands of these carpenters. In Tyre, the greatest city that Lebanon had ever known, he stained the stones purple, crushing the people of Phoenicia into splinters. When he finally broke through their walls, he would slaughter 6,000 soldiers, crucify 2,000 more, and sell the entire rest of the city into slavery. It would herald the end of the greatest civilization that this little mountain would ever produce. And yet, for all that they lost, this would not be their end, because Lebanon is a land of resurrection, and from the ashes and the dust, that great phoenix would rise again. Although, there was a bit of that going around. We often frame the rise of Christianity as a consequence of the bad behavior of the Romans, but really, its true origins came just as much from the evil of the Greeks. When Alexander the Great subjugated the Middle East in 322 BC, he did not do it kindly. Tens of thousands of crucifixions spilled out behind his army like the rats that ate their dead, but the violence he inflicted would be nothing compared to what his generals would have to do to keep it Greek after he died. And it was in this swirling sea of horror and change that to the south of these mountains in the lands of Judea, an idea had begun to blossom. From the texts of the scholars and the cries of the street came a word of spiritual revolution: Messiah. It meant the Anointed One, or as their Greek overlords would translate it, Christos. Someone who God would favor to rise the Jewish people above the great empires that had crushed them. He who could be their sword of light that would let them fight their way back towards freedom. He who could be their savior. But some were not content to leave God's will up to God, and they started a revolution of a bit more secular means. In Judea, between 167 and 152, a group called the Maccabees would push those monsters of Hellenism all the way back to the sea. By 143 BC, the Jewish people would again have an independent kingdom to call their own. And yet, no savior, no Messiah. Independence, yes, but also fear. The constant worry of that next conquest and the destruction of everything they'd gained. For 100 years they'd wait for that other sandal to drop. 100 years of relative peace and stability, and yet that dream of the Messiah who could liberate them forever would somehow only ever increase day by day, month by month. Even in freedom, that desire never abated. The people of Judea dreamed of a God so powerful that he could keep them safe from everything. A God so anointed that he could hold back that new giant staring at them from across the Mediterranean. That empire that in 63 BC would do exactly what they'd all feared. That new Alexander coming under the name Pompey. And just as Rome had conquered Phoenicia, so too would it conquer Judea. It was everything they'd feared and more, a shattering of peace so violent that even to this day, thousands of years later, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people remind themselves of it every single day. It was from this great injustice that came the loudest and saddest cry for a savior yet wailed behind these walls. And in that soil fertilized with blood, soon to be mixed with the ashes of their temple, those oppressed Judeans would grow their most memorable messiahs. Judas the Galilean, Simon of Perea, Athagod the shepherd, and eventually Joshua the Christ. each in their own way claiming to be that Redeemer King who could unite the Jewish people. And just like the one we remember best, each would be brutally tortured with their disciples eradicated in full. Their voices wouldn't echo through history quite like Joshua's did. The Romans made sure of that. Yet at their core, they all offered a similar idea. They were all the Messiah, each in their own time, a rejection of that Roman way of life and the impositions that its conquest had placed upon their people. A rejection of those Greeks and Persians who still lingered in the air like yesterday's incense. Christianity, whether it intended to or not, offered this region a homegrown, pacifistic counter-narrative to the imperialism that had crushed it time and time again. It wasn't just a rejection of Herod and the genocidal foreign military that backed him. It wasn't just a response to the crucifixions of Alexander and those Seleucid monsters who took his crown. It was a reimagining of what power could mean, of what a god could be. And in a world stuck between empires, doomed to live forever as civilians in a land for no man, I for one can understand why Joshua's message might have stuck. Or I suppose I should say Paul's version of it. But just like that early Christianity, let's head back north, because ultimately, this is a story about Lebanon. And they say that Joshua himself preached here. After all, this was the land of the carpenters, but whether or not that's just a myth, by 34 AD, there were certainly some Christians in the old cities of Phoenicia. After the martyrdom of St. Stephen in Jerusalem, many of his fledgling believers would have fled north to the Lebanese cities of the now Romanized province of Syria. Not that it would have been all that much more welcoming, frankly. In 54 AD, St. Paul visited his followers in the city of Sidon, but only as a prisoner on his way to be beheaded in Rome. In 67, 2 of Jesus' direct disciples would be brutally murdered in Beirut. One was even said to have been sawn clean in half, which may itself be just another myth, but I personally wouldn't doubt it. Because frankly, it's almost impossible to overstate just how dangerous it would have been for a Christian in the first century Roman world, and not just from the overlords who hated them, but also from the communities who surrounded them. Christianity wasn't just some new idea spreading amongst the Jews. It was a radical rejection of the status quo. It was anti-imperialism from a place of self-imposed spiritual superiority. It wasn't just religion, it was politics, and in both categories, it was fringe stuff. And yet, despite being illegal to the point of horrific death, up the western coast and across the plains of Syria, that new Messiah rose like the dawn. Day by day, that growing cult of survivorship bias crept across this overgrown empire, creating small pockets of underground believers, those who would band together in hopes of avoiding the violence of the state, a conspiracy of faith. But everywhere they blossomed came the immediate and unchecked bloodshed of the pagans and the Jews who surrounded them, those who saw these upstarts as nothing more than a cancer killing their societies from the inside. No different than all those other Christs who'd come before. And in turn, they would inflict the most unconscionable violence against them. The stories of atrocity are almost endless. In eastern Lebanon, in 107 AD, Eudokia of Heliopolis would be famously beheaded for the crime of giving away all of her money to charity. Well, that's what the church says anyway. It's more likely that she just refused to take a husband unless he became a Christian, but either way, she had to die. When Aquilina of Byblos converted one of her friends, she was stripped naked, whipped, and had hot metal rods shoved in her ears. She was 12 years old. It didn't stop them from cutting off her head. And for some, all of this horrific oppression was naturally a step too far. Turning the other cheek may have been the message of their Savior, but the drive for survival has a way of making sinners of us all. And to avoid the judgment of the obvious contradictions that any Christian responding to violence with violence would create, some would choose to frame that hypocrisy as his divine blessing. They would see themselves as glorious crusaders against the filth of the pagans who surrounded them, focusing on the Old Testament to avoid the commands of the New. But others would never pick up a sword again. And as time went on, schism beget schism. Of course it did. A room full of people can't agree on a pizza topping. Hundreds of isolated underground churches stretching from Spain to Armenia certainly weren't going to agree on a god. They couldn't even agree what type of God he was supposed to be. Was Joshua also a man, or was he divine? Was he an extension of God, or a God himself? Nobody really knew. And with no real authority to define what Christianity actually meant, and no statist violence yet to enforce it, things started to splinter. Every day it became that much harder to pull it all back together, by word or by sword. And the real world is not an easy place for ideology. Try to imagine the great flood of cognitive dissonance that crashed across the empire when in 320 AD, the General Constantine made public overtures towards Christianity immediately before conquering Rome, the night of the battle, no less. This new Caesar with his new God, overnight turning himself into the primary financial patron of organized Christianity. From then on, providing it with more than just beautiful architecture and safety from persecution, but nothing less than the might of all the legions of Rome. In one fell swoop, this underground religion glorifying martyrs of self-sacrifice was now helmed by the same empire whose atrocities inspired it to exist. And in turn, all the wars that Rome would now undertake would be done so in the name of and with the blessing of that supposedly pacifistic Christ. Which would cause three outstripped effects for that now insanely powerful religion. One, it would historically force their empire down the road towards Christianity faster than it ever could have without mass state violence. Two, it would turn that violence inwards towards the many schisms that defied Roman rule. And three, in doing those first two, utterly destroy the foundation myth about what Christianity was actually meant to be upholding. The cheek of Rome could never turn. It would never bathe the feet of the weak. Jesus' mercy would now come in the form of an iron cross, and if you didn't accept that, you'd be nailed to one. But with their newly evangelized empire, almost overnight, that horrific violence of the pagans rose back like some vengeful Lazarus at the end of Jesus' shank. In 363 AD, the Emperor Jovian decreed a death sentence to worship Rome's ancestral gods in public. In 380, you'd die if you worshipped them at all. Even just bowing before a pagan idol and they'd confiscate your home. To force people to convert, those now Christian authorities confiscated all pagan lands and made it illegal for them to create wills. They stripped them of their citizenship and right to legal counsel. They even brought torches to their homes, with them still inside, because they weren't Christians. So how could they be real Romans? They all deserved to burn. Just a few hundred years after hanging from that cross, the utopian ideals of those early dozen had become the arm that swung the hammer. And just like their savior before them, the faith that they'd envisioned would not survive Rome. What was reborn from the corpse of Joshua's dreams was now nothing more than an ideological Frankenstein, and it would render unto Caesar everything that was his and more. But seeing the very lions who ate him now wearing the skin of their lamb, some Christians across the empire began a quiet revolt. It's not like these were new disagreements. They'd formed long before Constantine drew Christ's name on his weapons. It was undeniable that the men who control God now bathed in blood, and there would naturally be those who defied that. And so from the east in Syria, like a soft wind in a cold desert, whispered a voice preaching calm. His name was Maron, the mystic of Idlib, he who would reject society and abuse himself in the name of Christ. In terms of faith, Maron was undeniably a reflection of his place and time, but he was, at least historically speaking, also kind of the purest definition of it. He was the ideal of what Christians in 400s Idlib were aiming to be, which I suppose makes sense because he's the one who taught them what to be, or at least he's certainly the one that we remember anyway. Maron taught that faith was primarily expressed through physical acts of defiance against nature, both against his own body's needs as well as the harshness of the elements around him. And naturally, given their ideology, self-sacrifice would have been all the rage among those early Christians. A bishop of Edessa would even attempt to get himself thrown down the stairs at the pagan temple in Baalbek, just for the spiritual fame of being martyred. But with Christians now the torturers rather than the tortured, Maron kind of had to do it to himself. To pay tribute to his god, he would undertake great lengths of fasting in the desert and mountains, attempting to sit perfectly still for as long as possible under the unbearable sun and deep snow. And with the spiritual power he believed to have built up from these exercises in self-harm, he would then claim to heal the illnesses of those who were less favored by God. A bit like the self-mummifying Buddhists of Japan, I suppose. It's a relatively universal idea that suffering lessens sin, and if nothing else, Maron certainly believed that. And as it turns out, he wasn't alone in that. By the time he retired a lonely hermit in the mountains of Anatolia, he'd have gained roughly the same number of disciples that Jesus would have when he'd died. Disciples who would then spread his word just as dutifully as they'd had. A few decades after Maron's death, and the scribes of Antioch would describe him as having as many as 40 living followers. Which of those, the one that we remember best, was called Abraham. Or at least, that's the commonly told story. We don't really know much about him, actually, but we can safely assume that he did come from money, and in between small bursts of asceticism, he'd found himself trading with some of the last remaining pagans deep in the mountains of Lebanon. Communities that, due to their remote location, had until then remained relatively true to their Phoenician cultural roots, despite all the risks that would have entailed. And naturally, that made this a community that did not appreciate his foreign presence. That is, until he paid their taxes. You see, the mountain that Abraham had come to trade with was drowning. Ever since the collapse of the Phoenician navy and its associated cedar trade, these were a people forever facing the wind. The Europeans didn't need their lumber like the Egyptians did, and they'd financed their conquest of Phoenicia by overtaxing those meager few who'd survived their wrath, which for this small community meant being given a debt that they would never be able to repay. But Abraham could. And all he asked in return were three things: that they respect his God, let him build a church to Maron, and come to listen when he prayed. And just like that, the mountains began to shift beneath him. Migrating up the coast had come the Christianity of Paul, but sweeping in from Syria came the name Maron. 50 years later, and the newly crowned Maronites were large enough to represent themselves among the international Christian community. In what was perhaps their most important decision ever as a group, which was also coincidentally their first decision ever as a group, when the Council of Chalcedon resulted in the eventual splintering of the Syrian, Egyptian, Armenian, Ethiopian, and Eritrean churches, the Maronites chose to remain true to the Pope, which unfortunately led to their slaughter. There's a bit of a pattern there if you keep paying attention. In 517 AD, 350 Maronite pilgrims would be murdered in Syria by their newly orthodoxed neighbors. And out of such a small community, this would have been like America losing the entire city of Boston. And yet, as if it was scripted, that sacrifice would bring salvation to their people. As if some wicked hint of things to come, the massacre of those pilgrims would turn the Roman eye. And on February 10th, 518, the Pope would officially recognize their church as sui juris, a sea within the sea. It would provide the Maronites with a form of tacit European support against the ever-growing schisms that now surrounded them, those freshly dug graves like seats at Rome's great table. It provided them power. And so not quite 100 years after that slaughter, and this region would effectively become Maronite country. There were still other groups of Christians, such as the Nabateans and the Gassanids, and some barely remaining Jewish communities, but for the most part, the followers of paganism had all been wiped away in Phoenicia, their symbols incorporated and their temples burnt with them still inside, that great phoenix of the mountain fully snuffed out by this avalanche of Christ. Those few centuries would be considered the Maronite Golden Age, and by the early 600s, before it all started to unravel, their communities would have stretched from Aleppo to the sea. But as ever, you cannot stop the schisms. And far to the south, in the deserts of Arabia, the region's last remaining pagans were starting to fall to a new indigenous form of Christ worship. Prophets had begun to arise all across the peninsula, raising armies of zealots under new schisms that better incorporated their ancestral Arabian beliefs. And yet, just like the messiahs of Judea, only one would get to claim that crown. Walking out of a cave at 40 years old, like a man reborn, what would eventually become known as the Prophet Muhammad announced that God had spoken to him. He would claim to be the final in a long string of Judeo-Christian prophets, each divine in their own way, but none so as much as him. In this way, he claimed he was more than just an Arab statesman responding to the slow arrival of religious cultural change, but rather the manifestation of a pure cosmic being. On one hand, he would say he was nothing more than a man, a conduit for the God who spoke through him, but on the other, that he was older than even the earth itself. He claimed to be the first human in creation and the last in resurrection, but also, at the same time, that he himself was in no way special. It was a contradiction that continues to cause conflict right up to the modern day. But just like Jesus before him, when he preached for peace. It's just unlike Jesus, he did so with a sword stained in blood. From the very outset, the ideology of Islam didn't deny the atrocities of empire, it just gave them religious-backed rules to follow. It did what organized Christianity was forced to do when it was swallowed by Rome, except deliberately from the very beginning. And just as Rome hadn't turned the other cheek, neither would Islam. Over 1,000 people would die before Muhammad would reign. This was not the sins of empire co-opting a religion, but rather a religion co-opting the sins of empire. And in this way, Muhammad would not become the type of prophet who would sacrifice himself for your sins, but rather the type to sacrifice others for their own. And when he died a normal human death, the men who followed him immediately set about inflicting that holy violence on their neighbors. Within a few weeks of Muhammad's death, the incoming caliphate would set about killing the rival prophets of Arabia, looking to secure their claim as the peninsula's one true connection to God. It was a war in which thousands of Arabians would die, tens of thousands, presumably. But then, just like that, everyone who disagreed with them was dead. The Caliph of the Rashidun would rule Arabia, and from now on, if you refused to believe that that one true God had spoken through Muhammad, some little patch of sand was turning red. By 632, rising up from those dunes grew the unstoppable zealots of Islam, no less numerous than the sands that had birthed them. And with that near-dead Persia facing endless war against an equally weakened Byzantium, just like with the Sea Peoples so many generations before, few who faced that storm would find themselves in Ark. The advent of Islam preceded a conquest that was up until that point arguably the fastest and furthest that any group has achieved in all history. The only other person who'd even come close was Alexander the Great, and it wasn't like he'd stuck around. In under 40 years, that fledgling Arabian empire stretched from Afghanistan to Tunisia, from Yemen to Lebanon to Georgia. Within 100, its successor would stretch from India to France. And it certainly didn't get there as a dove. So in the 630s, when those Muslims came to conquer Lebanon, it was pretty clear that there was nothing the Maronites were going to do to stop them. And so seeing that juggernaut barreling down on their people, the Christians of this region all aligned against their Byzantine rulers, every single one of them. A bit of a, if you can't beat them, join them, I suppose, but as it turns out, they all got kind of beat anyway. As with the arrival of Rome 600 years earlier, that shift towards this new incoming dominant culture might not have been immediate, but it was absolute. Over the next few centuries, the people of Phoenicia would yet again be introduced to new languages, new trade networks, new histories, and gods. Positions of power and authority would be handed to the conquering Arabs. They would become the landlords and government officials, the administration and centers of taxation. When the people of Lebanon spoke to their rulers, from now on they would be doing so in Arabic. The local Aramaic, the language of their God, would be slowly forgotten and die. Those who wanted to earn enough money would be wise to play along, and that first and foremost meant converting to Islam. And so perhaps it's just me talking, but I feel like it's easy to understand how for many people living here after that invasion, conversion to Islam kind of made sense. I suppose it was designed to. When you boiled it down, the government of that new Islamic empire presented its subjects with a pretty simple choice: follow Muhammad or pay a price. Which sounds awful, but compared to Rome, under either a pagan or Christian emperor, this was actually quite tame. After all, the conquests were one thing, but these Arabs had to actually rule this giant empire, and there weren't enough soldiers in the desert to force convert that many people that quickly. So, politically speaking at least, Islam was kind of like a stick made out of carrots. Towards the few remaining pagans, they'd be as atrocious as the worst of Rome's evils, but towards the Judeo-Christians of this new empire, denying their version of God was treated kind of like a self-inflicted wound that could be cured at any time. All you had to do was say the word. And with that choice, especially if you did it early on, would come the associated wealth, power, and influence of being, let's say, the upper middle of a new imperial society. Sure, unless you were Arab, you'd never really be on top, but it would be a seat at the table in a brand new world, and for many, that was better than nothing. And it isn't as if Islam was a new religion in the eyes of these Christians. They were just another form of heresy. There were plenty of schisms in this new monotheistic world, and Islam would have likely felt no different. Even 700 years later, in Dante's Inferno would still be referring to Muhammad as a schismatic. But at the same time, from a philosophical perspective, you can also imagine that calling these Arabs heretics probably felt a bit hollow. I mean, they'd clearly been blessed by God more than the Christians had. They'd conquered more land than anyone had ever achieved before them, more land than their prophet would have likely even known existed in his lifetime. So perhaps there was something to that. Why else would God have given them all that favor? Maybe it wasn't Islam that were the heretics. Maybe it was them. And on top of that, from the perspective of those with a little more secular down-to-earth considerations, there were many reasons to engage with what was now the world's largest empire. It had the best science, the best education, it had the largest and most complicated administration, the strongest armies, the best chance for traveling the world. And then beyond all that, of course, there was always the tax. By forcing the Christians into second-class citizenship and then giving taxes specifically to them, they didn't just outright kill their heretics, but rather gave them a form of social handicap, restricting them from trade networks and government offices. The jizya might not have been the final solution of the Romans, but in many instances, that softer hand worked better anyway. And either way, here in Lebanon, for those Maronites unwilling to follow this new version of God, that meant a cascade of social punishments that would never end. They would lose their lands along the coast and their access to foreign trade. They would lose their historic communities and churches, and in many instances, their lives. It was a non-stop pressure from all sides that did nothing but ever increase. And so for many, the only way out was to run. As their situation worsened, one by one, those Christians of Lebanon began a slow exodus away from the lowlands and up towards the freedom of the hills, just like the pagans had done to escape them 10 generations before. And yet, as ever, you cannot stop the schisms. And even in this landscape of apocalypse, facing enormous pressure from all sides, those Maronites would make an unthinkable decision and defy their one remaining source of protection. They refused the emperor in Constantinople and chose their own patriarch instead. And of course, the emperor of those Byzantines would crucify them for it. He'd send an entire community of settler soldiers to murder and replace them, a group called the Maronites. It's from their massacres that we get the word marauder. And now, with genocidal armies marching in from every direction with nowhere else to turn, those last remaining followers of Maron would be forced to run to the one place that had always protected them, the Mountains of White, Lebanon. But marauders or not, This was still the time of the Arabs, and with only 5% of their population Muslim, they were in a much weaker position than the maps might have implied. Survival meant more than just oppression. It meant concessions, coalitions. And so for the first 100 years, those incoming Arabs didn't really seem as bad as those who'd come before. Compared to that emperor in Constantinople, they seemed, kind of content to leave the Christians of Lebanon alone, just as long as they stayed in their mountains. And with all those rich old empires still in the process of getting slaughtered, there was more than enough for those desert people to eat. So why waste the manpower trying to squeeze this broken people any further? And so for a time, things were actually pretty good. At least they were calm. And yet, in politics, just as in religion, you cannot stop the schisms, no matter how many people you kill. For all the commands of their prophet, just like with Christianity before them, Islam started to fracture no sooner than it had begun. So let's jump back to 632 AD in the city of Medina. The prophet Muhammad is dead, and although that great empire of the Muslims has not yet even truly begun, as of this moment, it has already started to collapse. With Islam having twinned its politics and religion, the crises of succession aren't just problems of man, but of faith, and politics are anything but holy. Even with the best of intentions, every decision you ever make is going to deal somebody a bad hand, and then what? You just cut it off? Before their prophet was even buried, it was haunting the air like a specter. Who would be the new head? Who would pick up that halo and wear it like a crown? And no matter what you choose to believe happened that day, there are people on this earth who will murder you for it. There is no right answer, only wrong. And over the next, what has now been 1,400 years, millions upon millions of people would die over this one decision. It's the first great schism of Islam. Politics, baby. The first caliph of the Rashidun would be called Abu Bakr, which was much to the surprise of Muhammad's cousin Ali, a man many had long believed that as son-in-law of the prophet was presumed to be his heir. To see him undercut would have been a huge political slight. For Bakr to take power was nearly revolutionary, and to many the fact that he was nominated by the man who would become his successor felt a lot more like cronyism than it did the true will of God. And that didn't just stop there. One of the first statements Abu Bakr made after the death of Muhammad is that he was nothing more than a man, and that his followers should praise and pray to God instead, which is both theologically true within Islam, but also a clear political statement. It isn't hard to see the not-so-subtle meaning that bloodline doesn't matter. To remove Ali was to remove the idea that Islam was to be a dynasty. There would be no kings, no emperors. Name would never matter more than piety. But of course, already there were those who felt otherwise. Ali had a holy bloodline. He came from the original converts, and for many that meant he should rule. Which from a purely political standpoint for Abu Bakr meant that he was not the sort of man you want to keep around. Simply put, he was a thorn. A threat, perhaps the only person who could genuinely accuse the caliphs of not following the prophet's words and survive it. Which he did, quite often in fact. Despite everybody else falling in line, Ali would hold out for a full 6 months before giving Bakr his blessing. Even then, only giving in when the situation was undeniable. But regardless of who would take charge, from that moment on, Ali would always make sure that they felt the weight of his disapproval. However, in the early years, when that empire was still expanding, it was a lot easier to overlook the fractured politics of home. With wealth constantly flowing through the gates of Mecca, there was more than enough to go around to keep the people pacified. But 12 years after the death of Muhammad, and that empire would already be on its third caliph, the assassination of the second Umar would spell the beginning of the end for those Rashidun, although that would have likely been impossible to see at that time. The third caliph was handed a dilemma that most rulers wish to be handed. He took over on the verge of conquering Persia. There, his armies would encounter more wealth than they could have possibly imagined. Gold, silver, jewels, humans, more plunder than the deserts of Arabia had experienced throughout their entire history. And with that extreme wealth came extreme temptation. People who'd started their lives drinking goat milk in a tent were now facing the greatest luxuries that their world had to offer. And that is a very hard thing to say no to. However, that said, for his part, the third Caliph Uthman would perform his Arabian duty. He would melt those treasures down and hand them out to the people of Mecca. He himself would hoard nothing, or at least so they claim. But even within honesty, jealousy can breed lies, and the craziest thing about giving away billions is how many enemies you can make doing it. Uthman would even die for it. Historically, they'd frame his assassination as a response to nepotism. In Syria, the family Umayyad had gained extreme wealth under Uthman. In their now unchecked power, they'd begun defying the norms of Meccan austerity, which to many, particularly those of a jealous nature, was no different than blasphemy. And it really did not reflect well that they happened to be from Uthman's clan. Those who murdered him would leave his body unburied, call him a heretic, and see him tossed in a Jewish grave without Islamic funeral rites. The reasons why are many, but it's not hard to notice that it all seems to start around the time they got that money. But regardless of why, rising from the horror of that assassination came the fourth caliph, Ali. It wasn't as if the revolution was meant to put him in power specifically. It was just a process of elimination. He was the natural lightning rod for those who wanted change. Who else could speak up like he did? Who else had the pedigree to rule? And so, in June 656, 24 years after it was supposedly taken from him, Ali would be granted the caliphate, and he'd immediately set about making it his own. It's just this, too, was not a head that the body would accept. Times had changed from the days of Muhammad. Austerity might be the way of the Meccans, but it did not rule the world, and it certainly didn't rule in Damascus. In Syria, that family Umayyad would react to Uthman's assassination as nothing less than a declaration of war. And from their stronghold in the north, they'd spent the last few years amassing enough wealth to raise an army nearly 150,000 strong. The battle fought between those two heads would be nothing less than the battle for the soul of Islam, and quite tellingly to the future that it would create, it's a battle that nobody won. Although, somehow Ali still lost, because his failure to conquer these heathens had posed a question that couldn't be spoken but needed an answer. Why didn't God favor him? If Ali was more pious than the Umayyad, why didn't Allah crush his enemies? All of the early successes of Islam's armies had been considered miracles from God. People still firmly believe that to this day, so why didn't Ali get one? And if that was true, was the killing of Uthman unjust? All of a sudden, it was a lot harder to say. So when it comes Ali's turn to be assassinated, it doesn't come from the outside. It comes from his own soldiers. Not because they thought his ideas were bad, they just didn't see God in him anymore. The mandate of heaven demands that you win. So they killed him. There are those today who will never forget that betrayal. They're called the Shia. Although that term is a bit of a misnomer, I suppose, because as ever, you cannot stop the schisms, and these days the word Shia actually covers hundreds of different groups that disagree on virtually everything. Generally speaking, Ali being the rightful heir is pretty much the only one thing they do agree on, but now he's dead. And with Ali out of the way, those Umayyad would take his crown for their own. Only in all that civil war, it seemed to have gotten a bit scuffed up. No longer looked like the halo that it had once been. On their rise to power, those Syrian lords would murder not only Ali's son, but also Muhammad's grandson. They would destroy the structures of the Rashidun and move the capital to Damascus. From now on, there would be no more elections. Abu Bakr was wrong. The sons of power should remain in power. A caliph would be king. The only thing they really disagreed on was whose son. With those Umayyad came a new head for this now lumbering torso, but in neighboring Lebanon, for the most part, the limbs all stayed the same. Towards the Christians of this region, they'd spend their 90 years in power expressing that same indifference that the Rashidun had, only now with the economic benefit of having their capital just next door in Damascus. To keep the peace with this potential Christian threat on their doorstep, Syria and Lebanon would be given special attention, the simple promise of be good and we won't come get those taxes. But in the 740s, cataclysmic civil wars rocked the Umayyads in ways they couldn't recover from, and in the chaos, yet another head would be mounted on this empire of schism. They would call themselves the Abbasids. Based in Baghdad with no thoughts of Syria but revenge, the Abbasids would become historically violent, keeping their constantly weakening grip on power purely through the threat of horrific reprisal. And in an attempt to project their Islamic values to subjects who barely even considered them human, as well as pay back the virtually infinite debts they'd incurred in their rebellion, they taxed the Christians of Lebanon in ways the Umayyad had never dreamed of, years in advance, decades in advance, demanding payments none could ever pay, and yet demanding them with some very serious threats. By 752, that meant every single denomination of Christian in Lebanon would revolt together against this new empire. It was the first time they had ever united under a single banner. Not that it did them much good, granted, because according to Maronite sources, the subsequent massacres of those Abbasids killed nearly a third of all their people, burning entire villages to the ground. Men, women, children, the Abbasids didn't discriminate. Even those who took no part in the rebellion would pay for it with their lives. But outside these mountains, that squeeze was no different. This new empire was bankrupt, both financially and morally. And so in the lands of Jordan in the 790s, a group of ancient Christians called the Tanukids found themselves living between Iraq and a hard place. As Hellenized Christians, they'd converted to Shia Islam to avoid the violence sweeping through their region, but in this new Abbasid empire, violence was inescapable. And almost as soon as they'd converted, they'd experience a nearly endless wave of Sunni repression, the goal nothing less than their full eradication. So facing total destruction, they'd flee to Lebanon. Alongside 11 other tribes with near-identical backgrounds, those barely Shia migrants would flood towards that once Christian coast, filling the pockets left behind by their newly slaughtered Maronite neighbors. And although they didn't quite care for the Shia exactly, Baghdad was still quicker to trust these converts than the local Christians they'd just committed a genocide against. And so, despite being considered vermin in Jordan, here in Lebanon, soon enough they'd be pronounced the new rulers of the southern mountains. Their power would center around an area called Chuf, extending roughly from Syria to Beirut. The intent of Sunni Baghdad was to place these ostensibly, shall we say, expendable Muslims in the path of any future Christian rebellions, sort of like shock soldiers of the empire. They would be allowed to live, just not in Jordan. Which frankly might well have worked if it weren't for our old friend Schism, because these were not united times. The Abbasids might have taken the crown, but that halo was now forever out of reach. A near endless bloodletting, because now absolutely nobody was willing to accept the wrong type of believers in charge, and there were simply too many wrong types of believers. It didn't matter what part of the empire you were in. Revolt was everywhere, forever. There's only so much control that violence can bring. It's hard to imagine that at their core in Baghdad, they were simultaneously experiencing the greatest golden age that a caliphate would ever witness, because starting on the fringes and working towards the center, every few decades another province would fall to revolution. Spain peeled off in 756, Morocco in 88, Tunisia in 800, and Egypt in 868. In 869, they'd even experience a revolt of their nearly endless Bantu slaves. For 15 straight years, those kidnapped Africans would band together into a breakaway state called Zanj. But ultimately, this is a story about Lebanon, and it would be in Egypt's revolution where they would be affected the most. Claiming heritage from Ali himself in the 900s, a new Shia caliphate would rise in Cairo, the first non-Sunnis to take power since Ali. Under the name Fatimids, these warriors of schism would conquer all the way up to the Byzantine border, splintering the remaining Abbasids into pieces from which they'd never return. But being the first Shia ruler in a world of Sunni violence came with an unspeakable amount of danger. And in turn, if only as a means of political necessity, they'd let their people believe far more freely than anyone could in the lands of the Abbasid. Almost none of their subjects were Shia, so tolerance was a necessity of survival. And so there in Egypt, in all that tolerant disorder, a brand new religion would blossom. Multiple, actually, but the one that we're going to focus on called themselves Al-Mawahidun, or the monotheists, although everyone else rather insultingly calls them the Druze. The Druze are a complicated people, as I suppose all people are, but unlike most offshoots of monotheism, they are a purely ethnic religion, meaning you can't convert in. According to the Druze, every single one of them living today is just a reincarnation of a Druze who came before. As they see the world, the only time anyone should have been allowed to join was in the first few years of their religion existing, because according to them, all people on Earth are just reincarnations of those alive at that time, so nobody needs to be offered again. They already had their chance and they missed it. But that said, not everybody missed it. Here in Lebanon, for whatever reason, those freshly immigrated Tanukids decided that this new monotheism was the light. And for reasons that nobody seems to have recorded, those dozen tribes that had run to these hills began to convert en masse to this new religion. They converted in such numbers that soon enough the true heartland of the Druze wasn't in Egypt, but these mountains in Chuf, stretching from Syria to the sea. And yet, of course, you cannot stop the schisms. In the late 800s, another Shia sect would rise, only this time in Iraq. They would be called the Alawites. And they too would be an ethnic religion, but under the violence of the Abbasids, they would be forced into the mountains of Syria, where they'd create an insular community that had learned to keep its faith secret from outsiders. And although those two religions would be dramatically different in virtually every respect from the perspective of those looking in, they would share many similarities. Most importantly, both the Druze and the Alawite faced the same dilemma. To hardline Islamists, they were both heathens, no better than pagans, and it was therefore imperative that they be slaughtered. But to a more liberal Islam, they were just another branch of Shia. This disconnect, which created a balancing act that would forever taint their interactions with the more standard Muslims who ruled over them, like a form of theological axe that perpetually hung above their heads, forever waiting for some imam's signal that it was now time to chop. That is, if they ever had the army to do it. Because apostates or not, those Abbasids were a bit too busy to care about this new change, even if the Fatimids weren't destroying their rule in the West. In the East, things were somehow even more untenable. In the 11th century, an army rode in from the steppes greater than had existed in centuries. Using their own take on Sunni Islam like an endless casus belli, the newly powerful Seljuk Turks spread across the world like an unstoppable wave, and they had no love for the Christians or the Shia. Between 1040 and 1090, they would conquer from China to Oman to the gates of Constantinople. In the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they'd even capture that Eastern Roman emperor. And although Europe was nowhere near as strong, wealthy, or united as any of those empires of Islam, that loss would send shockwaves all the way to the gates of London. In 1095, the new emperor of that collapsing Byzantine state cried out for help from his neighboring Europeans. He'd send emissaries to his rival Catholic pope asking for mercenaries to help him retake Anatolia, like a head begging for some limbs. And Rome would answer that call, although they weren't exactly coming to help. To the weakened French Pope, this was a bit like a Hail Mary, a chance not just to save Europe from its oncoming civil disaster, but to resurrect Christendom under a single banner. And so he sent out that call. That Pope would offer salvation to murderers, adulterers, blasphemers, and thieves. He would spiritually pardon both past and future sins. He'd forgive your debts and protect your lands from undue authority. No matter what atrocities you'd committed, if you went on the crusade, your crimes would be judged in a different court. If you murdered correctly, the Pope would claim, Jesus would send you straight to heaven. It was a simple promise taken up by hundreds of thousands. That said, the Holy Land was a pretty long way away, and most people couldn't afford that, no matter how religious they were. So many of those idealistic zealots would turn towards the heathens at home. Why go all the way to Jerusalem when you could get to heaven without even leaving your city? Both the church and the nobility might have said that the Jews were off limits, but that's not what some Germans heard. So even though the emperor and the pope outlawed the pogroms, nobody really showed up to stop the slaughter. And as this mass of guilt-ridden monsters slouched their way towards Bethlehem, they dug up the soil behind them like some 6-foot trail to hell. At least, in the beginning. By the second and third waves, things were a little different. The pious and insane had given way to a more professional killer. In the minds of these new soldiers, this war, like all wars, was just another path towards wealth. These second and third sons of noblemen, criminals, and minor lords from minor lands would form themselves into semi-professional armies, hoping to conquer the greatest entrepôts and trade networks that their world had ever known. The lands of silk and spice, the ports that provided Europe's luxuries. These men didn't just go to praise God, they went to make money. And for the most part, those soldiers were French. Yet rich though they wished to be, they were still Christians at heart. It might be far from their home, but this was still their holy land. And so as those paladins of Paris murdered their way down the coast, the emotions they felt grew stronger with every step. These were the lands of their Bible, names that they had recited in church since they'd first learned to speak. So imagine how crazy it must have felt for these genocidal foreigners with no reference to this land but the word of their priests that just as soon as they crossed the mountains and entered the Levant, they'd find a group of Catholics all but lost to the memory of Rome. Those who called themselves the Maronites, cut off for hundreds of years and yet still somehow maintaining their allegiance to a patriarch they didn't even know. They were like living propaganda, a sea within the sea. And finding these brothers in Christ, those French zealots would naturally begin to treat them like God-given allies, Sherpas of these mountains of white. They would use the Maronites in their armies, support them in their trades, and turn them into the administration that could help maintain their newly built crusader states. They would bring them new languages, new trade networks, new emperors, but most importantly to them, the same God. And in turn, those Maronites would teach these new invaders the most valuable secrets of the Orient. It was through these Lebanese guides that many of the advancements of the Arabs would enter those early French universities. They'd help translate the golden age of Islam and kickstart what was then a relatively backwater Europe. They'd transfer mathematics, science, philosophy, and astronomy. They'd bring maps and news of the world to the East. And in return, those French would make them feel strong again. Which was naturally not the case for everybody else. These were true zealots, and zealots rarely have a soul. When those crusaders entered Jerusalem, they would murder or exile virtually every living inhabitant. If you weren't a Christian, you didn't deserve to live. And in a system many would recognize from modern-day politics, they would declare any house that had been emptied during the war up for grabs. Any Christian who lived in a vacant home for a year could claim it as their own. Just don't think about what made it vacant. For the next 170 years, as those French kept their grip on this coastline, the Maronites would find themselves back on top of the Lebanese pile. No Byzantines to take their autonomy, no caliphate to tax them. This new French head served them exactly as they'd always dreamed. And so even after those crusader states fell, the Maronites would sustain that connection with their new European friend. But by the 1500s, those days were long gone. And in the vacuum that followed grew the Turkic, Greco, and in some ways Persian empire we now call the Ottomans. And rising from a shattered Anatolia, they were one of the few survivors to outlast the great scramble of the post-Mongolian world. There, they would cement their place as the newest extension of a conquest that had been happening for nearly 500 years, that same conquest that had once inspired those French Crusades. And so by the 1500s, it wasn't the Pope nor the Great Khan that this region would fear. It was the Ottomans, Having strategically married into the Byzantine nobility and taking their throne in Constantinople, the incoming sultan of those Ottomans declared himself the new Caesar. His empire would be the new Rome. Europe might reject that claim on mostly religious grounds, but it's not like Julius had been a Christian. Times change, empires change, and now they'd changed towards Islam. Which isn't to say that the people below them necessarily had. It would be many hundreds more years before the populations would take to the god of these new horse-lord kings, and yet those horse-lord kings would keep it all the same. Because to put it simply, from a practical political perspective, they kind of needed to. Islam was an imperial religion in a way that others simply weren't. It was a lot easier to rule over Christians in an Islamic empire than it was to rule over Muslims in a Christian one. Plus, and perhaps most importantly, it was simply the best option for justifying their conquest. Their soldiers followed the right type of Islam, and the people around them didn't. So whether it was purely political or a genuine expression of their faith, by claiming to be the standard bearers of the Sunni, they'd given themselves a nearly endless cause for war. They were both Rome and Mecca, Caesar and Caliph. That said, neither of those two groups would have really seen them as legitimate, not at the start at least. How could they be the caliphs without any connection to Mecca? How could they compete with the Seljuks, who could trace their lineage to Ali? These were upstarts with a sword, and so the only way they'd be able to convince their neighbors was violence. So, naturally, those Ottomans would use it to its maximum effect. History might not have been on their side, but once they conquered Mecca, once Jerusalem was theirs, they'd see who had the courage to publicly disagree. And so, if only as a matter of geography, they'd begin to conquer Syria and Lebanon, the first dominoes on the way to those holy cities. But just as soon as they'd cross that border, those Sunni zealots would find something that they felt needed to be murdered, people not of their book, the Alawites and the Druze. It was no more than a moment after they'd met those semi-Shia apostates that their genocide would begin. The Sultan would claim it was a response to raids on caravans, or perhaps a refusal to pay their taxes, which I suppose in some respect was probably true. As a semi-independent insular people, rebellion was never really far from their minds. It was what had kept their community alive all these years, but of course that's not why they were actually killed. It was politics. For the ulema of Constantinople, there was no excuse small enough to begin this slaughter. They needed an opportunity to show their subjects that they were the most pious Sunni around, and in the eradication of non-believers, they would find it. 1517 would see nearly all of Aleppo's Alawites corralled and slaughtered, the goal nothing less than full eradication, and for the most part, it was achieved. In 1518, they'd come back for the Druze. In 23 and 24, they'd burned 73 villages to the ground, riding back to Constantinople with their saddlebags overflowing with decapitated heads. Those who survived, they'd enslave. In a single expedition, over 300 women and children would be kidnapped and sold to whichever Turk could pay for them. Wave after violent wave would crash against these mountains, and with each great murder would come a resurrection, a new generation attempting to push back against this violent new overlord, but none would ever succeed. 1585 would see the worst year in Druze history, with 20,000 professional soldiers sent to their mountain villages on a mission of true eradication, an unchecked genocide that didn't stop until there weren't enough people here even left to dream, an entire religion now just bags full of heads rolling through the streets of Constantinople. Those meager few who did survive from now on pretending to be Muslims, they had to. Those who didn't would simply die. But this is Lebanon, the land of the phoenix, and it's rare that something dies here that doesn't return, especially the Druze. After all, that's the core of their religion. Surely one of the great comforts of believing in eternal reincarnation is knowing that even when your people are slaughtered to the last, you can be sure they're all coming back. Which is kind of what happened, actually. Just as soon as those guns stopped firing, this little mountain community started roaring back to life. Or, I should say, at the very minimum, the lords who ruled over it did. Specifically this one. His name is Fakhr al-Din. He is by far the most important Druze to ever grace this world, and by extension, one of the most important Lebanese to ever exist. Some would even argue that he's actually the first Lebanese to ever exist, although that's a bit contentious. That said, he was a pretty contentious guy. His father had led the rebellion that had caused the worst slaughter of his people, and yet he'd waited out that violence from the safety of Constantinople, sucking up to the Sultan so hard that he'd even give him his father's throne right after he had him killed. But he had no intention on being a puppet. With power over his people secured, al-Din immediately set about rebuilding their shattered economy, planting the cash crops of silk and mulberry over the many now deserted farms. With their road to China blocked by the Ottomans, Europe was starved for luxuries, and anyone who could fill that void would become richer than they could possibly imagine. So naturally, he set about filling it. Yet to achieve this dream, he needed labor, farm labor, and almost all of his people were dead. However, just one mountain to the north, there were a veritable sea of workers, the Christians, the Maronites. Once his people's greatest enemy, they'd been left all but powerless in this post-Crusade world. And so nothing if not a pragmatist, al-Din recognized that manpower could still be found in men without power, and he soon began to hire as many Maronites as his fields could employ. Growth beget more growth, and more land required more labor, with more fields, more castles, and more need for control. But conversely, even as a tyrant, he understood inherently that his power relied on concessions, not abuse. To sustain his rule, al-Din presented a form of respect towards his Christian subjects that they hadn't felt since the French. In his lands, Maronites would be allowed to build churches, they'd be allowed to carry guns and ride with saddles, they'd be respected in public places and paid a good wage. In return, he'd let them tell the Catholics in Europe just how good he'd been acting. They could feel safe putting their faith in his friendship, buying his goods, and most of all, selling him their weapons. Which meant that when the Medici, Europe's wealthiest family, decided that it was time for a crusade of their own, it was in al-Din where they'd place their hopes. Well, after he killed their first choice, anyway. It would be under his leadership that for the first time in all Phoenicia's history, a local-born ruler would control the region of Lebanon in its entirety. Many, therefore, consider him to be the founding father of the nation, even though he died hundreds of years before that nation actually existed. And although it might not have been perfect, he would also set a standard for what it would take to rule this region successfully. During his time in power, he would promote a mixing of communities, of economies, and bloodlines that would last for generations. It wasn't exactly on equal terms, granted, as the Druze did remain the landlords, but at the very least, these two communities who'd been forced together for reasons of war would now find reasons for peace. So, of course, it almost goes without saying that the Ottomans beheaded him. After all, a man so capable, so close to their capital, could never survive for long. But that said, this is Lebanon, and it's rare here that something dies and doesn't return, especially the landlords. Even without his head, his lineage would last throughout the ages. They still rule the Druze today under the name Jumblat. I suppose that's the beauty of a Frankenstein. You can cut off one head and they'll just sew on another, and yet for all the limbs below, it wasn't hard to notice that none of the heads that came after him seemed to be quite as smart as his. I suppose that was the intent. Over the next few hundred years, things in Lebanon only ever seemed to worsen. New heads might fall, but their taxes never seemed to. It was part imperial collapse and part imperial decree, after all. They couldn't exactly rebel if they had no money, but that said, you can't create a cancer and expect it not to spread, and so by the 1800s, the diseases of these limbs had started to reach the core, and soon enough every little region with their petty little tyrant began to chip away at that stumbling corpse, each limb attempting to grab enough meat to survive once the body fully died. They'd call it the sick man of Europe, Although that's a bit of a misnomer, because just like the Abbasids before them, the true illness of the Ottomans came out of Egypt. In Cairo, a powerful Albanian commander named Muhammad Ali began to form a rebellion that the Sultan in Constantinople simply couldn't control. With regional autonomy a function of the Ottoman state, it was almost inevitable that someone would rise far enough to challenge the central authority, and unlike the Lebanese Druze, this Egyptian soldier was too far and too powerful to simply pluck out and replace. Having crushed the local Mamluk governors who'd ruled since the time of Saladin, the rising Muhammad Ali stretched his arms in every possible direction. Although still ostensibly an imperial subject, he would begin to eat that great empire from the inside out. And what could that sultan even do? He was far too powerful for them to put him down, and so to sustain his own power, he had to pretend that Ali was still their man. The more he backed down, the further Ali advanced, and before long, his armies were at the borders of Lebanon. Which left the local emir, a man named Bashir Shahab II, in a bit of a bind. The politics of that time are nearly impossible to explain, but to put it as simply as I can, his power base had once come from all of Lebanon's religions, but he himself was a Maronite. That made him the first Christian to ever be granted the title of emir. However, it wasn't because of his administrative skills or his love of his people, but rather the belief that by promoting a Maronite he might be able to disarm his fellow Christians without causing an uprising, although that did not exactly work out. His nemesis, the Muslim governor who ruled over him, saw a chance to expand his own power and demanded more taxes from that emir than he could have ever dreamed of collecting, taxes that he would be forced to squeeze exclusively from those Maronites because he had just disarmed them, so they were the only group that couldn't fight back, at least not yet. But now completely hated by his own people, he would be forced to rely exclusively on the Druze to survive, and so when they began to turn on him in their own time, he had nowhere else to go. In 1821, facing certain death, he fled to Egypt into the arms of Muhammad Ali. One head cut off, and another sewn on. But his story was far from over, because in Cairo, with a new powerful ally, he'd join Egypt's soldiers as they rolled up through Lebanon and be re-given the lands that he'd been forced from just a few years before. Only now, instead of crushing the Maronites, it would be expected that he would crush the Druze. Through the conquest of Ali, those Druze would face yet another Sunni strongman attempting to prove its piety through slaughter, which again put Bashir in a bit of a bind, because even with the armies of Egypt to support him, it's not like he had a lot of friends here. He'd been ousted by the Muslims and betrayed by the Druze, not to mention spending half his career oppressing the Christians, so why would anyone trust him? The only answer was concessions, sectarian concessions. Choose a single side and bribe them into submission. So from 1825 to 1840, he'd fill his administration almost exclusively with Maronites. He'd support their church, clergy, and politicians above all others. What were once the near-exclusive rights of Muslims were now in the hands of the third-class Christians. And it was a power that would only increase when in 1839 the Ottoman government would pretend to give minorities equal rights. Which isn't to say they intended to enforce that necessarily, but at least on paper the rules had changed. And so, with a strength that they hadn't felt in 700 years, the Christians of Lebanon began to flex. In other words, things started to look a lot like war. All that tinder just waiting for a spark. And colonial Europe, at the very height of its power, realized that they were carrying a box full of matches. In 1840, with the backing of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, Constantinople would finally force Ali back. But in true European style, once they got their foot in that door, those allies had no true intention of leaving. And now, pretending that they cared for the safety of that collapsing empire's minorities, London would begin to publicly champion Lebanon's Druze. All they asked in return was that they be allowed to send missionaries to live among them, a new Protestant Abraham for these mountains of white, which to the Catholic Maronites next door, as well as the Orthodox alongside, would be considered nothing less than a declaration of war. So although the rule of those Druze had been relatively soft-handed, and they'd once saved the Christians from genuine destitution, the friendship that had kept this land united for the past 300 years crumbled in under 20. the arms of that Frankenstein began to cut each other off. By 1860, that rising animosity would spark into an unfathomably bitter civil war, each side taking their turn murdering each other's civilians, burning their villages, and destroying those friendships that had once kept this region strong. Yet again, genocide would return to this land of resurrection, only this time, all the Sultan had to do was sit back and watch. He wasn't even particularly interested in the outcome, just hoping that both sides would somehow destroy each other. Which, in a certain respect, is exactly what happened, at least for a time. But even though they had the numbers, the Christians couldn't outspend their landlords, and as the guns flowed to the Druze, the tide shifted against them, and those Maronites would see over 10,000 of their civilians massacred in the coldest of blood. It might have been a war that they started, but it was not a war that they would win. And yet, Lebanon is a phoenix. And just as it had in 517, just as it had in 1071, news of that slaughter of Catholics spread to Europe as if the deaths were their own. And sensing an opportunity, that now mighty nation of France decided it was time to return to the Holy Land. Now backed by one of the most powerful armies on earth, Paris was in a position to make some very serious demands. They'd send 6,000 soldiers that they'd call peacekeepers and force Constantinople to put a stop to the slaughter. From there, alongside an equally opportunistic England, they'd devise a state within a state that the Ottomans would have otherwise never agreed to. In this now half-independent province, those European powers would attempt to stabilize the system that Fakhr al-Din had once created, only this time, instead of the lands belonging to the Druze, they would hand it to the Maronites. They might have lost the war, but those backing Europeans would make sure that they'd take its spoils. At least for a generation, anyway, because it seems the world around them had other plans. And no longer just sick, but now truly terminal, the empire of the Ottomans would join the First World War with little way out but the grave. And as that head collapsed, the limbs would go phantom. And as their society began to eat itself from the inside, the people of Lebanon would face yet another horrific atrocity, not even 50 full years since the last. It's an atrocity that the world seems to have all but forgotten. They call it the Kafno, or the Great Famine. Over just 3 short years, from 1915 to 1918, both the Druze and the Maronites would see a forced starvation that would kill nearly 50% of their people. Their populations would drop by numbers that would rival the Holocaust. It's a horror that has been all but buried by the sands of time. And yet alongside them would be buried their empire. And as the world that they had known for 400 years collapsed into a half-dozen unchecked democides, the question on the minds of the Lebanese was not so much independence, but rather who would take over next. Few would have ever believed it would get to be them. However, in the back rooms of the Europeans who'd controlled virtually the entire world for over a century, they, of course, felt it was only natural that they take the reins. The political climate might have changed a bit since their colonial heights, but their arrogance certainly hadn't. And so when they won this war, they'd expect its spoils. That's why they went to war. So despite what they'd tell their allies in Arabia in 1916, with the world still raging, that European Entente agreed in secret on how they were going to divide the Middle East when it finally ended. From Anatolia to Iraq, it would all be theirs. Not that they'd mention that to the Arabs, of course. With the Ottoman army over a third Arab conscripts, inspiring a pan-Arabian revolution would be no different from the British perspective than a genuine invasion of Anatolia. And if the lie of a pan-Arabian kingdom was what it took to inspire that, well, so be it. The Foreign Office even went so far as to help them design their flag. But for it to work, they'd need a patsy. And in Mecca, they'd find one. His name was Hussein bin Ali, and his Hashemite family had been the emirs of Mecca for as long as anyone could remember. Angered with the Turkification coming out of Constantinople and the minority democides it had been inspiring, this symbolically powerful emir had lost all faith in Ottoman rule. The future was independence. It was a pan-Arabian state, and he was the natural man to lead it. So in 1916, he began to accept guns and gold from Britain in exchange for a promise that when the war ended, he'd be given a kingdom under a Hashemite banner. Yet that was just his first step. The real goal was always to establish a caliphate. Without it, he'd never be able to rule the lands that the British promised him. On their end, however, it was a promise they never meant to keep. These were going to be their lands, not his. But appearances couldn't be dropped just yet, and so as a means of both appeasing him and also dividing his potential future control, his sons Faisal and Abdullah would be given their own kingdoms to the north. It would be fair to say that despite being one family, they were far from united in their vision of who should be in charge. It was as king of Greater Syria that his son Faisal would be pressured by London to make a historic deal with the leader of the European Zionists, defying the will of his own people to allow for a limited Jewish homeland within the now Syrian region of Palestine. His hope was that by giving the British a reason to protect him, they'd stop those ever-hungry French from eating his new Syrian kingdom, but obviously that didn't quite work out. The European ink was already dry, and so less than 4 months after he was crowned, an ultimatum came out of Paris: leave or die. And as the armies of France descended on his cities, he chose life. But still somewhat loyal to the British, or at the very least now better understanding the futility of his position, he'd be given the kingdom of Iraq, while his brother Abdullah would receive the Transjordan. Their father, however, wouldn't be so subservient. He wanted what he was promised, and what type of caliph would back down to foreigners. From his base in Mecca, he refused the demands of those overconfident British, particularly that of Zionism. He wouldn't give an inch. And not wanting to anger his sons, who were still very much so their lackeys, the British would give him multiple chances to recant his position, and yet in every instance he'd reject them. So in 1925, Britain would find a family a little more willing to play ball. We know them as the House of Al Saud. In the north, France would be playing their own games, conquering the mandates that they'd secretly claimed during the war. In 1920, their armies would roll into Damascus, destroying Faisal's fledgling kingdom and carving it up into bite-sized pieces. Unlike the British in the south, who'd aimed to coddle the Arabs in the hopes of winning their favor, the French had a different goal: suppress the majority through whatever means possible, and in turn, embolden the minorities to help them keep the masses from uniting against their control. Along the coast would be created a homeland for the Alawites, and the desert one for the Druze. The Syrian heartlands would simply be split into two. But here in Lebanon, things would be a bit more complicated. As France's closest regional ally going back 1,000 years, the Maronites would leave the war expecting special treatment, and in practice, for the most part, that meant farmland. More than guns, more than money, more than the assurances of European politicians, what the Maronites of Lebanon wanted most were farms. Half of all of their people had just starved to death 2 years before. If they were going to feel in any way safe in this new post-Ottoman system, they were going to need enough farmland to feel like that kafno could never happen again. And so that is precisely what France gave them. Rather than attaching it to the new Syrian, Druze, or Alawite states, the Lebanese mandate would be granted the areas of Bekaa, Beirut, and the Tyrian hinterlands. Not quite the full extent of the once mighty lands of Fakhr al-Din, but certainly the closest the Maronites had ever seen. It's just, the thing about gifts is that they tend to come barbed. And these areas weren't exactly empty. They also weren't exactly Maronite. So despite the fact that they all spoke Arabic and were therefore technically Arabs, in practice that wasn't really as uniting a concept as its proponents liked to pretend. Just beneath the surface, there were ideological and historical pains that couldn't be covered with such a simple slogan. For many of the Christians, and even some among the Druze, those growing cries of Arab nationalism felt a bit less like promises and more like threats. Historically speaking, when a new caliph rose, they tended to be the ones who paid the price. But now second class in a society that they'd led for hundreds of years, the Muslims of that new Lebanese state began to look for a road back to power. A pan-Arabian empire, even if it was led from Mecca, would still undoubtedly favor them first. It might not be independence, but when was Lebanon ever independent? The only reason the Maronites had taken power was France, so in that Arab nationalism, they'd see a future that put them back on top, or at the very least, the upper middle. And so just like that, the first major schism of this new Lebanese state would be built into its very heart before it even began. In exchange for those farms, the Maronites would take on a problem that they would never be able to solve, at least not through violence. Not that France wouldn't try. Of course, the constitution they'd created, for all its nice words about pluralism, did little to hide its one main goal, enshrining Christian preeminence above all others, giving the bulk of that authority to their Maronite allies and splitting the remaining power down neutered ethnic lines. It wasn't quite as brash as what they'd do in Syria, but here in Lebanon, they'd divide and conquer all the same. And as you might expect, that didn't quite work out as planned, neither here nor in Syria, for that matter, who after being broken apart would find themselves coming back together after barely a decade. Nor, for that matter, would it work out in the south, where from the moment of its outset, the Mandate of Palestine would see nearly endless discontent. And although this is a story about Lebanon, I think it would be impossible to truly understand what happened in this nation without talking a little bit about that mandate to the south, because one can never truly comprehend the European dominance of this region, nor the Arab nationalist response, without at least some understanding of the rise of Israel. So let's jump back to the 1800s, the beginning of this great migration, a small number of Jewish immigrants trickling into Palestine in response to the now seemingly endless European pogroms, developing tiny communities under the auspices of Ottoman control. It was a response to both the growing aggression from the surrounding European communities as well as the rather conversely newfound rights of Jewish citizens being instilled in Vienna. With the ability to speak publicly without fear of reprisal, some Jewish leaders had begun pushing for a return to their once holy land. In their eyes, they would never be able to integrate among non-Jewish Europeans, and so therefore their survival meant creating an enclave that they could control. Or as they called it, der Judenstaat. Zion. It was a movement that would become known as Zionism, although, like with everything, there would be disagreements from the outset. For every Zionist who believed in the creation of an Israel, there was another who believed it could only come through the development of a Palestine built under mutually beneficial terms. It's a disagreement that still continues to cause mass violence within both societies to this very day. Yet for a time, it was an influx that was accepted with relative calm, a few thousand settlers who mostly kept to themselves, living in small, constantly failing collective farms. Their threat to the standing Arab order, let alone to the Ottomans who ruled over them, was frankly more existential than it was practical. But in the 10s and 20s, with European hostility growing across the continent and Britain taking charge of the Palestinian Mandate, the numbers of those willing to risk their lives to restart in this new foreign land began to dramatically increase. 5,000 became 10, then 20, then 50, and to those who saw nothing new in this land except them, those changing demographics started to feel a bit more dangerous. Before long, the Arabs would riot against them, and soon after that, they'd massacre. 1920 would see the first true hint of the problems yet to come. In a village called Tel Hai, Syrian Bedouins came hunting for what they believed to be hidden French soldiers. Having just lost their country to these foreign invaders, they saw little difference between the Parisians and the Prussians, both just Europeans in a place where they'd only recently arrived. But when their search for soldiers turned up nothing but farmers, confusion led to misunderstanding, led to murder. In 1921, that violence would increase. In Jaffa, Zionists protesting for a communist Palestine began a citywide brawl with their competing Jewish socialists. And sensing it as an opportunity, Arab nationalist mobs began to break into unrelated Jewish businesses and homes, killing dozens of unsuspecting civilians. A pogrom in all but name. As more settlers flooded into the country, that pressure only increased. Despite a vast majority of both sides still aiming to live in peace and voting for policies of continued integration, echoing in from the fringes had come the cries for war. In 1929, a far-right mob of 6,000 Zionists paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, carrying proto-Israeli flags and demanding that the Wailing Wall be theirs to control. Led by a Lithuanian who'd fundraised via doctored pictures of the Al-Aqsa Mosque replaced by a Jewish temple, many Arabs saw this as confirmation that no Jew had any intention of living in a free Palestine. They began to believe that they were meant to be replaced just as soon as those Europeans had the power to remove them. And from that fear grew a belief among some of the Arabs that the only way forward would be violence. And so yet again began a massacre. By the start of the 1930s, that pendulum of sectarianism had begun swinging beyond any one person's control, that trunk of Arab nationalism sprouting new limbs of violence. And among the Jews, that once extremist view of exiling or murdering all Palestinians started to gain prominence and eventually even popular support. It was a feeling that would only increase once their brethren in Europe had to face one of history's greatest atrocities, an industrial horror so awful that it is almost unimaginable. They call it the Shoah, although most know it as the Holocaust. In the run-up to that great evil, a migration of European Jewish populations would run towards every corner of this globe, but nowhere quite like Palestine. Here, those fleeing masses would come in numbers so large that they would have changed any country, let alone one already on the brink of war. From 1930 to 1940, even with Britain suppressing their arrival as much as possible, the Jewish population of this mandate would triple, which would mean in just 10 short years, the number of European settlers rose from an 11th of the population to nearly a third, which I suppose can be hard to fathom. So let me offer a comparison. To achieve similar numbers in America, they would need to see 130 million immigrants in a single decade. That's 10 times what they have ever taken in. For Europeans, it would be like if Germany took 30 million Syrians during the Civil War. The question is not if it would be moral to do so, but rather how it would change things if it was done. In Palestine, it caused an enormous shift in both the size and scale of those already burning problems raging across the Mandate. To the pre-existing people of this land, whose culture had dominated since 630 AD, this new wave of European settlement, however justified it might have been, was simply too much to bear. The once tolerated moderate Zionist request for a home within their home had genuinely started to feel like a threat to their home's existence. After all, by 1932, Palestine was the only Arab mandate that Britain hadn't granted its independence yet, and that was a fact that had started to feel a little less coincidental and a little more like a deliberate ploy to give their land away. It wasn't, granted. As the old saying goes, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, and imperialism is often nothing if not stupid. The reality was Britain supported neither Zionism nor the Pan-Arabian identity. They'd secretly backstab both of them any time it was in their interest. In their truest heart, all Britain really ever wanted was control for themselves, and if that took a lie or a massacre to obtain it, well, so be it. But by 1936, the Arabs of Palestine had had enough. That perpetually mounting fear and anger and repression sparked a revolt that turned into a full-blown revolution, a 3-year struggle of violence and depredation that would be crushed with even more violence and even more depredation. To some, it was a fight for freedom, and to others, an attempt at personal power, a confused but passionate sectarian uprising meant to obtain Palestinian independence. And of course, once the British and their hated police were gone, it would turn towards the expulsion of these now seemingly endless Jewish settlers. Only Britain would not be shaken off so easily, and with a torrent of state violence in return, they'd retain their control of this tiny Levantine mandate. But the times were changing, and with Germany growing in power on the continent, the threat of a Pan-Arabian revolt was as great to British interests as it had once been to the Ottomans. And so, sensing the war to come, in stepped famed diplomat Neville Chamberlain, the hero of Czechoslovakia. In 1939, his government suggested a compromise. Jewish people would be given a formal homeland within the overall state of Palestine, but it would comprise no more than 5% of the total territory. It was a lose-lose that left both sides feeling furious. The British walked away looking weaker than ever, and to the people of Palestine, be they Jewish or Arab, it was a truly historic failure. Everyone understood what it meant. The Empire of Britain was done. 5 years later, with Germany having killed European power in that great murder-suicide, it would be the Jews' turn to revolt. And in 1944, hardened by their international Holocaust, they would start attacking British positions with a form of guerrilla warfare now almost exclusively referred to as terrorism. They would bomb railways, ships, government offices, and police stations. They would assassinate both police and diplomatic attachés, and as their rebellion grew, the people of that once great island decided that they'd had enough of war, and they demanded that their government prepare plans to leave. Emboldened by their successes, the Jews of Palestine began to flex more than they'd ever dared before. Their public statements no longer suggesting a willingness to live within a state they couldn't control. They would create an Israel, a homeland for their people. And so as that rebellion continued to grow in violence, it became clear to all sides that the true war was about to begin. Weary and broken, Britain would formally hand control of the region to the UN, who would in turn attempt to solve this growing crisis by splitting the mandate into two. But just as with Chamberlain before them, all it really did was further embolden the militants. Without troops to stop them, the partition would do little except further spur each side's violence. And now with a state to work from and a legal backing for their cause, each would attempt to expand their borders with as much ferocity as their armies could manage. Back up north, in their own mandates, French attempts to sustain control would be just as ineffective as those of the British. By the 1940s, both Syria and Lebanon would declare their independence and join what was then called the Arab League, the region's newest attempt at solidifying a pan-nationalist union. But just as with the Hashemites before them, a union only really works if its leaders are united, and Arab nationalism was nothing more than a front. Although many within their kingdoms would both fight and die for the cause, when it came to the leaders above them, the only thing that they would ever allow to unite the Arabs was them personally taking charge. Which is exactly how they joined the First War for Palestine. Although they might have been a union on paper, each Arab army would remain split and untrusting, aiming only to conquer their own piece of this newly broken land. None seemed truly concerned with the return of an actual Palestinian state, but rather the inclusion of that state within their own growing borders. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, united on paper, divided they would fall. So despite having a vast majority in population, it was a war that the Arabs would lose. That new Israeli state would take not only all of the land that the UN had given them, but 60% of the Palestinian lands alongside. Those who experienced it would call it the Nakba, which translates in English to the catastrophe, or in Hebrew, the Shoah. Half of all Palestinians would either flee or be forcibly coerced from their homes. Others would be slaughtered in violence that's only being acknowledged in the modern day. 700,000 civilians removed from their homes, their history, and their land, few of which would ever return. Many of those refugees would flee north to the newly christened Lebanon, where 5 years before, the region's many ethnicities had come together to declare their own independence from France. It was itself a nation barely in existence, suffering from its own complex political demographics, and yet already it was facing yet another problem that it had little in the way of controlling. The agreement Lebanon's newly freed leaders would have come to would be called the National Pact, and by sticking to that pact, they'd hoped, they'd be able to maintain a calm, pluralistic society that would outlive the unity of their shared Parisian enemy. But of course, that was a lot easier said than done. So those Lebanese leaders came up with a few rules, red lines that none would be allowed to cross. The first was that there would be no integration with Syria. The Christians in power rightly understood that a Syrian overlord would turn them from a ruling class majority back into a subjugated minority, and so that was simply unacceptable. But in turn, the Muslims and Druze expected that the Maronites would do the same with the West. No France, no Britain, and soon enough, no America. Put another way, the Maronites had to accept that they were all Arabs, but the Muslims had to accept that they were a different type of Arab. And if they could do that, they could agree on the second rule: who gets to be in charge. In 1932, the last time Lebanon had taken a census, Christians accounted for 51% of the population, which was certainly no longer the case. And even if it was, the French had arguably skewed those numbers to begin with. However, for the sake of unity, the pact would pretend those numbers still held true. And not only would the Christians retain their 6-to-5 ratio in Parliament, they'd also get the presidency. And it was a presidency, I should note, that has almost unchecked executive power. So while the pact agreed that their prime minister would always come from the Sunni, that was a bit of a deception, because no matter who filled that role, they'd be legally subservient to their Maronite president. And so from the outset, they'd aimed to build a Frankenstein in the hopes that it one day might walk like a man. But the thing about identity in a Frankenstein land is that there is no one part that can be defined without the others. If one limb is Shia and another is Druze, what does having a Christian head even mean? What is that creature if not the sum of all its parts? And what happens if that head can't control the body? Don't all those limbs just start to rot away? Lebanon had few answers except hope. And for a while, they were given reasons to. Rot doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And like in much of the rest of the world, post-war rebuilding meant that for 10 straight years, Lebanon would see unprecedented economic growth and a clear shift towards industrial modernization. Even as those hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees flooded across their border, their economy blossomed in virtually every corner of the nation. All religions, all ethnicities, everyone had a reason to see a brighter future. And yet the rot remained. With the albatross of ethnic division and a neo-feudal government almost purpose-built to keep things stagnant, sustaining that growth past its initial boom was all but impossible. And so as time went on, the poor got poorer, the rich got richer, and every day it got harder to keep everybody in line. No matter how many bribes their lords gave out or how good the GDP looked in the news, that gyre of sectarianism only ever widened. As the geopolitics of the world convulsed around them, this now almost entirely static government was simply unable to keep up. And now obviously there were those who saw this coming, a handful of leaders who purposefully defied the schisms to work towards a pan-Lebanese national identity, those who saw that the only true way forward would have to be secular, but for all their realism, they were simply no match for the sectarian corruption. And so as the Second World War came to a close, it was clear that the world was reaching the end of an era, especially in the Middle East. Something new was going to have to be born. The Europeans had clearly seen their peak, and from now on, they would be on the decline. In the aftermath, the United States found itself, if only through process of elimination, on the path to becoming the world's leading superpower. But they weren't quite there yet. Nor, for that matter, were they alone in trying, because across the globe, another great nation was rising, and having dismantled and stolen all of Eastern Europe's factories, down to their very nuts and bolts, no less, having replaced their governments with puppets and subjugated their people beneath a curtain of iron, the Soviet Union had begun its own march towards supremacy. Though neither would call it by its name, by the early 1950s, both sides would be aiming to become the world's leading imperialist, their goal nothing less than control of the entire planet. In other words, the Cold War had begun. But not everyone saw themselves as bait for these new beasts to devour, and with a new republic in Syria and an Israel in Palestine, it was clear that the borders of the mandates wouldn't hold for much longer. In the gate of their kings that now walked like corpses, there were many who saw children waddling forward towards revolution, those who saw themselves as neither Americans nor Soviets, but rather Arabs. And so from the philosophers to the fields, that Ottoman-ending dream of a Pan-Arabian identity came roaring back to life. They might not have known exactly what it would look like when it arrived, but they all knew something had to die for it to be born. These kingdoms, colonies, protectorates, mandates, what were they now if not in the way? The war might have been over, but the revolution was only just beginning. And so 1952 in Cairo, the last in the lineage of Albanian strongman Muhammad Ali would be deposed by a coup of army officers led by Egyptian Arab Gamal Abdel Nasser. The main complaint against the king wasn't just that he was a naive monarch in a time of revolution, but rather that he was descended from a Balkan. Simply put, he wasn't Arab, and he never would be. But Nasser was. And so were the Syrians, who'd earned their own independence from the French a decade before. And so together they'd have the, shall we call it, luxury of paving the new ideology that would underpin this post-colonial Middle East. Which, for his part, Nasser would define through secular, socialist, Arab nationalist terms. His people would not be subject to one religion or place of birth, but rather a loose framework of historic, linguistic, and cultural connections that had once spanned from Morocco to Yemen. He would frame the Arab people as lost descendants of that once mighty caliphate, now trapped under leaders who failed to share his vision. Which on paper probably sounded amazing. Like some Thomas Jefferson of Egypt declaring his people's freedom from centuries of imperialism. It's what the Hashemites had promised a full generation ago before settling into their own thrones. And yet, just like Jefferson before him, that declaration wasn't only one of independence, but also of war. While he might have been espousing unity of his people, the subtext was that every other Arab leader was going to have to fall for him to achieve it. And so naturally, his survival depended on getting some guns. Real guns. The big ones. And in 1952, that meant two-stepping the ever-complicated dance of the Cold War. It wasn't like he had a lot of friends, and it's hard to buy guns from people you're denouncing. Which put America in a bit of a bind, because even though he'd been helped on his rise by the CIA, a secular, socialist, anti-imperialist leader sounded a lot like the Soviets. And American public opinion, now fervently pro-Israel, was not on Nasser's side. So although Eisenhower believed that controlling the Middle East meant aligning with Egypt, Congress and the State Department disagreed. They saw their future in Turkey, and in turn supported a military alliance that aligned Istanbul with Iraq, two of Egypt's greatest enemies. It was a giant, glaring signal that Nasser couldn't trust the West, and so he turned to the East instead. If the U.S. wouldn't sell him the guns he wanted, he'd buy them from Czechoslovakia, and once he got them, he'd show everyone what controlling the Middle East actually looked like. In 1956, with those guns in hand, he'd do the unthinkable and nationalize the Suez Canal. It was a giant spit in the face of effectively the entire world, but most specifically the imperialists in Britain, because without control of that canal, they'd no longer be able to access their few remaining colonies abroad, not to mention what it would mean to the oil imports that sustained their economy. To lose the Suez meant nothing less than the death knell of their once mighty empire. But this was the 1950s, so perhaps what was even more important was that it also put an embargo on Israel. And so while the British public might not have had the stomach for another Middle Eastern conflict, the Israelis certainly did. A rising Nasser was their greatest threat. If he did what he claimed, they were going to lose their nation, and if that happened, they were probably all going to die. So from the very second that the Soviets started selling him those guns, Israel quietly prepared for war. In October of '56, just 3 months after nationalizing the canal, the Israelis would invade Egypt with the backing of both the British and the French. Their goal was not just to weaken Nasser and take back the Suez, but to kill that growing Pan-Arabian identity before it could blossom into something that not even the superpowers could control. And yet, despite achieving a massive tactical victory, it would be a war that they would still somehow lose. Even though Israel would destroy their military and take the entire Sinai, Nasser would not only remain in power, but he'd also keep the canal. The real losers would be Britain and France, because this was not a war that America wanted, and in their eyes, any pressure on Egypt drove the Middle East further into the arms of the Soviets. In response, Eisenhower would make it clear who the real top dog of this new world order was. If they didn't withdraw completely immediately, he'd destroy their economies. No longer would Europeans be allowed a foreign policy that didn't first and foremost consider the desires of the United States. Which, for Nasser, was a massive symbolic victory, even if that's all it was. He might have lost his army, but by surviving the war, he'd become the face of an undeniable new order. To many Arabs, he'd begun to look like the leader that he'd always claimed he was. He'd outplayed both the British and the Israelis and put the single most important piece of infrastructure in the entire Middle East back into Arab hands. From then on, it was clear that things would escalate. Realignment was all but guaranteed. And to Eisenhower, watching British power in the Middle East come to an end, it seemed clear that without a new backer, these kings were all going to fall. Which in his mind, a Cold War mind, meant that if America didn't replace them, the Soviets would. And regardless of if that was actually true, he began to prepare a now famous decree. From 1957 forward, America would become the world's police, imperialists wrapped in a U.S. flag, preaching democracy just so long as it voted for them. We've become accustomed to the concept today, but at the time it would have been monumental. Called the Eisenhower Doctrine, it effectively stated that from then on they would stop any Middle Eastern country who wanted to align with the Soviets, be it through diplomacy or force. It was a doctrine that would be tested just a few months later in Syria, and it was a doctrine that would fail. Like the British before them, American imperialism in the Near East would backfire almost every single time they tried to apply it. With each intervention, Nasser's anti-imperialist alternative only seemed to gain more clout, and to the endangered Syrians, now with American-backed Turks and Iraqis surrounding their borders, an alliance with Egypt started to seem like their best chance at remaining free. And so on February 1st, 1958, those Syrians would agree to a union with the now powerful Egyptians, combining into something called the United Arab Republic. It was the precursor to what they believed would be a pan-Arabian entity strong enough to defeat not just the Americans, but also the Soviets, now creeping their way across the Middle East. They might have been socialists on paper, but the most important defining feature of their union was simply that they were both Arabs. And while in hindsight, it's easy to say that that clearly wasn't going to last, in its time, that union rattled this region like an earthquake. And to counter that growing new threat, the Hashemite kings of Iraq and Jordan would put aside their differences and attempt to combine into a union of their own. But it would be killed before it even began. Just a few months after their announcement, a Soviet-Iraqi coup rocked the country and killed their king. Yet another cataclysmic shock that empowered that seemingly unstoppable UAR. And with his greatest rival now dead in the ground and nobody left with the power to stop him, it started to seem like Nasser might actually do what he claimed. He might genuinely unite the Arab world. Which, in tiny Lebanon, these changes hit the political landscape like a series of atomic bombs. To the Maronites in power, this would have been an almost insurmountable enemy, growing not only on their borders, but also in the minds of their people. Their army could never dream of fighting the Syrians alone, so what could they possibly do against the combined might of the UAR, be it military or ideology? Their national pact had agreed that the foundation of their state would be an Arab identity. And what was the UAR if not a union of Arabs? So sure, the pact had said that they'd never unite with Syria, but this wasn't Syria. So who could those Maronites align with to stop this if not the United States? And if they made friends with America, wouldn't that naturally have to include Israel as well? Well, yeah, it would. And so over his 6 years in power, Lebanon's President Camille Chamoun would push the country as far as he could from its Arab roots. He'd not only ignore the Israeli invasion of the Sinai, but he'd also vocally promote Eisenhower's imperialist doctrine. And in both cases, he would be the only Arab leader to do so. And with the UAR breathing down his neck, he would push things too far. In 1958, President Chamoun would make two decisions that would all but guarantee the death of a united Lebanon. One, he'd assassinate a journalist who'd promoted unity with that new Arab republic, and two, he'd formally invite America to help him not only falsify parliamentary elections, but also break the Constitution so he could run for president a second time. And although they'd mostly disagree with him, simply by asking, he'd destroyed the National Pact. By inviting in that foreign Western power, he hadn't just broken the rules, he had broken the nation. And that isn't to say that he was wrong in believing that there was a threat to his power. That part was certainly true. Basically, as soon as the ink was dry, the UAR had begun funneling guns into Lebanon, even going so far as to provoke the beginning of a civil war. It's just his response only made things worse. But with the country falling into chaos, despite having no love for their intensely unpopular president, Eisenhower would send 55,000 troops to help bring Lebanon back under Christian control. And in Beirut, his doctrine would get its first win. America would hold back the UAR. But as it turns out, that might not have even been necessary, because just as Nasser had brought forth that dream of a united Arab identity, so too would he collapse it. In 1961, the Syrians realized that despite coming together over a shared anti-imperialist ideology, those Egyptians were starting to act a bit like an empire. Nasser had sent his loyalists to Damascus to take power from the local governors, and in turn, those Syrians began a counter-revolution that broke the nation back into pieces, that great experiment of the United Arab Republic lasting only 3 years. Nasser's power had reached its peak, and from now on, it would forever be on the decline. Yet just 2 years later, and another convulsion would rock the Middle East, only this time it would come out of Iraq. In February of '63, with support from the CIA, the anti-communist Ba'ath Party would take power in their own coup, and then a month later, the newly independent Syria would follow alongside. And although they'd eventually be stopped in Iraq and Damascus, that new regime would take hold, eventually falling into the hands of Soviet-aligned Alawite dictator Hafez al-Assad. Perhaps you've heard of his son. Hafez al-Assad was far less concerned with a pan-Arabian ideology than those who'd come before him. What he really wanted was more power for Syria, or perhaps more accurately, for himself. But to do so, he'd rely mainly on a feint. His expansion wouldn't come from being an Arab, but rather from being a pro-Palestinian. Which isn't to say he actually cared about Palestinians. Certainly he didn't want them in his country, but in them, he saw an endless cause for war, be they in Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, or elsewhere. So long as Assad claimed to back them, he'd always have a reason to invade. In fact, it's even how he came to power. In the mid-1960s, King Hussein of Jordan, now the last in the Hashemite line, was surrounded by enemies and facing Israeli military incursions all along his border. Even though he was likely their closest potential friend in the region and effectively a client state of America, the Israelis wanted to provoke a war, and this was how they were going to get it. So in 1967, they'd push their armies deep into the lands of both Jordan and Syria, forcing Nasser to blockade their ships and give them enough of a diplomatic cover to launch what they'd call a preemptive strike on Egypt's air force. Again, the Arab League would head to war. And again, they would lose. Just like 20 years before, their alliance was barely worth the paper it was written on. Israel might have been the enemy, but that didn't make them friends. Arab or not, their armies had no love for each other, and although they'd fight together, each would do so alone. Which is also precisely how they'd lose. In the aftermath of that 6-day war, Syria would lose the Golan Heights, Jordan the West Bank, and Egypt the Sinai and Gaza Strip. Over 400,000 more Palestinians would be forced to flee their homes, yet another catastrophe for a people who had already faced so many. And just as in the 40s, Arab stability could not survive the embarrassment of yet another failed war, with Israel having crushed the combined militaries of the entire region in less than a week. Those once proud Arab nationalists began to reconsider the ideology that had gotten them there. Egypt had lost. Syria had lost. Iraq had lost. So who was there to even believe in anymore? And failed by man, by secularism, and especially by Nasserism, many Arabs began to turn towards a higher power, and so began the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. In response to that second great victory, the United States would begin to care less about the Arab League and instead put their full weight behind Israel, who they now saw as the region's strongest power. As Muslim anger spilled into the streets, the remaining Jews of the Middle East would be assaulted en masse, forced from their homes, and often murdered. Nearly 1 million Sephardic Jews, split across a half-dozen nations, given no choice but to flee the countries that they'd called their own for over 1,000 years. Many would find their way to Israel, but others would see Zionism as the cause of their destruction and head anywhere else that might take them. In Jordan, the government would teeter to the edge of collapse. With his population now well over 50% Palestinian, King Hussein understood that the only way to sustain his power would be through integration. Their struggle would be his struggle. But conversely, to hold back the Syrian and Iraqi armies now staring at his throne, he'd be pushed further into the arms of America. It would be an endless balancing act that he'd be forced to walk almost entirely alone. The Palestinians themselves would be in no less conflicted a situation. With little in the way of power, some fell under the belief that the only way back to their homes would be through a torrent of stateless violence, joining guerrilla resistance groups known as the Fedayeen. And no longer believing that success could be achieved through open war, they'd switch their tactics towards terrorism. With the loss of the West Bank, that meant undertaking a series of attacks against international targets from their strongholds across the Jordanian border, and that was very much so not in the interest of its king. It would be one of these attacks that would push Israel to again send their troops into the East Bank in 1968, one of their many attempts to root out these growing Jordanian-based Fedayeen. But despite their military victory, just as it had been in their war for the Suez, they would lose the battle of politics alongside. Even with all the people they'd kill, what the Fedayeen mostly took away was that the Israeli army was anything but invincible. And so within days of Israel's supposed military success, thousands of Palestinian and Jordanian citizens would flood into the ranks of this now growing resistance. For every Fedayeen that the Israelis would kill, another 10 would join them. And soon enough, the collectively known PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, would begin agitating a form of public policy that some might even call hubris. Imagining their paramilitary power now on par with that of the state, those Fedayeen would begin calling for a Jordanian revolution. Not at all seeing the irony of refugees stealing a nation to support their ideological ends, in 1970 they would hijack American, Swiss, and Israeli airliners, flying 4 separate planes onto Jordanian land and then blowing them up before the international press. Even with nobody left on board, it was an act that shocked the world. And so watching his country slip away on the front page of every newspaper on the planet, that King of Jordan declared a civil war. His army would root out the militants one by one, surrounding their camps and sweeping through the streets, looking for anyone who supported the now terroristic PLO. They call this the Black September. And in Syria, sensing an opportunity to destroy their greatest rival, that Ba'athist predecessor of Hafez al-Assad would attempt an invasion with over 10,000 troops secretly dressed in Palestinian colors. But just as with the PLO alongside them, they were no match for the army of Jordan and were sent back with their tails bleeding between their legs. In the chaos of that failed invasion, Hafez al-Assad would declare a military coup and take the nation as his own. Now realizing that maybe they weren't as powerful as they'd once believed, the PLO struck an agreement with the Jordanian king. The Fedayeen would be allowed to leave the country with their lives, just so long as they promised to never return. And again, Syria would be presented with an opportunity, another way to use those Palestinians to further their own ends. With conquest in their minds, they'd let the PLO cross their desert and enter the camps along the Lebanese coast, which meant that by 1971, the struggle for Palestinian liberation would find itself headquartered in southern Lebanon, joining the now 300,000 people already peacefully living there as refugees. And naturally, just as Syria hoped, it was a peace that they would break. When the PLO took formal control of Lebanon's camps, Palestinians represented around 1/10 of the Lebanese population. And whether they were being given passports or not, that was a demographic shift that everyone in the country could feel. Regardless of how much the people might have sympathized with their cause, this was not a situation that they were happy to be forced into. The question wasn't if it was moral, but rather what it caused. And for a Lebanese government already teetering on the edge of collapse, this was nothing less than a full-blown crisis. In the eyes of Assad, however, it was kind of a gift. As much as they'd pretend to be the champion of the Palestinian people, in secret, Damascus had nothing but contempt for the PLO. To them, neither Lebanon nor Palestine were anything more than a breakaway region waiting to come back to the greater Syrian fold. They were Frankenstein nations, topped by the wrong heads. And the best thing that could possibly happen for Damascus was that the Maronites swallow those Palestinians, choke on them, and die. Then, when their corpses were both writhing on the ground, Syria could just step in and eat them. 2 birds, 0 stones. And even in the best of times, this would have been a very dark omen for Lebanon, and frankly, these were not the best of times. By the 1970s, the nation wasn't just dying, it was dying for a revolution. And you couldn't really pin that one on Syria. 30 years after independence, and the Christian-led government still hadn't taken a single census. With emigration and all these new refugees, there was no question to anyone what it was going to prove. If the power of the state was built on demographics, then knowing new ones could only lead to change. And in a religiously based neo-feudal system, the ruling families, regardless of their religion, weren't just going to hand away their power for free. Which isn't to say that any of the religions or ethnicities were actually all that united in practice. Because being Druze or Greek or Armenian doesn't come with some natural politics attached to it. The Orthodox religion doesn't make you communist any more than being Maronite makes you right-wing. Every nation speaks in 1,000 voices. It's just, by the 1970s, in Lebanon, a majority of those voices had started to scream. And from the hills rose the songs to fill the gaps that the government couldn't, each calling out like a siren towards their own personal rock. To those Greek communists who wanted an independent Lebanon, there was a song for you. To the Nazarite who wanted to unite with Egypt, there was a song for you too. And to those multitude of Maronites who wanted a Black September all their own, there were so many songs for you. And soon enough, all those songs turned to chants, and those chants into marches, every corner of the country blossoming its own little flag and band of marauders, glorified gangs fighting over the scraps of the national corpse. On the one side were the Christians and the hard-right nationalists, their militias ranging from street gangs to full-blown paramilitaries. Together, they operated as part of, or rival to, the umbrella organization known as the Lebanese Forces. Names like the AFL, DKK, the Kateb, MDJ, GZ, MKG, Al-Tanzim, the Tigers, Guardians of the Cedar, the Maratha Brigade. Many would call them fascists, which I'd argue is both true and also an oversimplification. In the most basic terms possible, what they wanted was a strong, independent, Christian-ruled Lebanon. But not just any Christians. Them. And in response grew the coalition of the Lebanese National Movement, headed by popular Druze politician Kamal Jumblat. He himself was the descendant of the once great Fakhr al-Din, and without question he felt the weight of that position. The title he'd been given in Druze society would be lifted directly from the nation's feudal past. He was genuinely a lord of Lebanon, and yet also a socialist, which, as paradoxical as it might sound, made him the natural center for any wide-scale rebellion against a Christian-led rightist movement, because be you a leftist, a Druze, or a Muslim looking for change, in him, you could spot a little bit of yourself. So where he saw overlap, he saw an ally. Jumblat's umbrella of revolution branched so wide it could cover virtually anyone who'd agree to join. His movement saw hardline Islamic extremists fighting alongside Greek atheists. It contained both the Syrian ultranationalists and the Palestinians they were looking to conquer. Many would go so far as to call them communists, which I'd argue is both true and also an oversimplification. Really, there was no one single worldview here, except that the current world had to change. Which is all to say that the Lebanese Civil War wasn't Christian versus Muslim, it wasn't communist versus fascist, it wasn't even Syrian or Israeli or Palestinian or even Lebanese. But at the same time, it was all of those things. So as every little corner began yelling with its own little chant, soon all those different lyrics just sort of turned into noise. And it's in that cacophony of revolution where those thousands of battle-hardened, primarily Sunni Palestinian soldiers, fresh off their nearly successful coup of a much stronger nation, entered Lebanon, quite literally carrying their weapons in their hands. And there wasn't much the Lebanese government could do, frankly. The region had deemed them the sacrificial lamb, and just 2 years before, under immense pressure from all the other Arab states, their president had quietly handed away large sections of the country. The Palestinian camps were not only now able to govern themselves, but the entire southern region of the country would be treated as de facto autonomous. Whether the average Lebanese agreed to it or not, their country would from now on be legally designated the headquarters from which Palestinians could continue their struggle against Israel, and therefore also the shooting grounds for when those tanks came to kill them for it. And as you might imagine, not everyone was too happy about that. A literal army had marched into their country unopposed and been handed the administration of hundreds of thousands of desperate people. People who had far more in common with Jumblat than they did with those in power. And so the government braced for war. The PLO had already tried a coup in Jordan, so what was to stop them here? Marines might have put down the rebellion of the 50s, but with Vietnam now spitting them back in boxes, Americans weren't really ready for another endless war with an entirely new subcontinent. The government was effectively on its own, and the Maronites weren't the only ones who knew that. That said, they did have one ace up their sleeve, at least in their minds, because according to declassified documents from the CIA, the Maronites in government had made a secret deal with Syria. In exchange for letting in the PLO, they'd been given broad assurances that if things ever went too far, they could trust their friend Hafez al-Assad to send in his army to protect them. All he ever wanted, he said, was a stable Lebanon. And it was under those assurances that in 1975, 2 events would rock this little country into war. The first came in February, when that same right-wing Christian ex-president who'd inspired the revolution of the 50s tried to monopolize the historically unionized fishing industry off the coast of the predominantly Muslim city of Sidon. And when the people protested, someone shot one of their most popular leaders dead in the street. It was a man who represented not just the Sunni religion, but also the politics of Nasserism. He was a pan-Arab Muslim socialist. It was as if his murder was purpose-built to offend every single faction of the nation. In the riots that followed, Jumblat's coalition, the Islamic radicals, and Arafat's Fedayeen would all fight side by side for the very first time. They would even die together. And that would matter a great deal a month later when the real violence began. On April 13, 1975, Pierre Ismail, then leader of the powerful Kateb militia, was attacked in a drive-by shooting by what were supposedly members of the PLO. And even though he wasn't personally hurt, a man was killed and a response was all but guaranteed. They might not have ID'd the shooters, but trust they'd find someone to stand for this. And as they searched the country for someone to murder, a bus full of Palestinians happened to be returning from an anti-Israeli political rally. It was a route that took them right through the heart of Christian Lebanon. And so, turning down a narrow alley that would forever bear their memories, militiamen jumped out from the walls and riddled their bus with bullets. 27 dead, 19 wounded. They'd call it revenge, but I doubt anyone on that bus would agree. 3 days later, and the death toll was over 300. By October, thousands. The nation was divided, and the government had completely lost control. They call this the first stage of the Lebanese Civil War, although internationally I'd argue it's best remembered as the Battle of the Hotels. I suppose in the modern day it's hard to imagine, but right before they shot that bus, this strip between the St. George on the Water and the Holiday Inn a few hundred meters away would have been one of the most desirable tourist destinations on the planet. And now they were a killing grounds. Videos of the Beirut Holiday Inn on fire are some of the most important images captured in the 1970s. They fundamentally changed the international perception of Lebanon as a nation. No longer was Beirut perceived as a Paris of the Mediterranean, but now just another Palestine to depress the world's news. And then came the massacres. In January of '76, the Lebanese front would murder over 1,000 civilians in a Palestinian-controlled neighborhood in East Beirut. In turn, the coalition would respond by wiping out a Christian village. By February, the city would be cut in half. Christians in the east and Muslims in the west, self-derived ghettos meant to keep their ethnicities safe, but nowhere was safe. It was chaos. There were snipers in residential towers staring in your windows, roadblocks cutting the country like a knife. Death was a daily occurrence, an hourly occurrence, and that once political revolution quickly started turning into an uncontrollable sectarian killing spree. In short, it was exactly what Syria had hoped for. For their part, the Lebanese government simply had no answer to the violence. To support the Christian militias would destroy the nation politically, but to not support them would effectively give up the country to revolution, and then they would lose anyway. If they didn't help the Christians, those in the military were going to defect, but if they did help them, the Muslims would do the same. And so somehow, in their infinite wisdom, they found a way to do both. And so by March of 1976, professional soldiers had formed their own militias and the tide of battle had turned towards the coalition. Jumblat's power began to snowball. It was the government's greatest fear. Nearly 75% of the country now belonged in the hands of the revolutionaries. The loss of their historic Maronite control now seemed all but inevitable. And so, fearing death, that Frankenstein opened the door and invited in a vampire. On June 1st, 1976, the Arab League was asked by those in power to march in nearly 30,000 soldiers, and of course Syria would be the first to answer that call, because they weren't invading, they were invited. And they weren't the only ones coming. Seeing that the PLO might actually turn Lebanon into a genuine enemy of Israel, those Maronites found themselves a second ally in Tel Aviv. And what's more, it was an ally with all the weapons of the Americans, but even more importantly, none of their sensitivities. And overnight, those Israelis would flood the Christians with weapons, funding, and airstrikes, that holy trinity of war. With these new friends, it wouldn't even be a week before they'd turn back the tide of revolution. By July, the Lebanese forces were back on top, making gains that they'd failed at since the beginning of the war. Gains that became victories, that became massacres. In August, they'd overrun the refugee camp at Tel al-Zatar, where once again those Christian militias would murder over 1,000 innocent Palestinians, pulling boys from their mothers just to shoot them against some wall. 2 months later, and the coalition would exact their revenge on the Khatab village of Aisha. But Israeli bombardment would cost them far more than they'd gain. Now facing a much more complicated enemy, Jumblat's coalition would agree to a ceasefire, but that too was just part of the Damascene plan. To al-Assad, all that meant was that there wasn't a single ethnicity in the country who wasn't willing to invite him in. But while Syria might have sent the peacekeepers, they had no real interest in maintaining the peace, and so as soon as their troops had settled into their posts, they'd murder Kamal Jumblat. Or I suppose I should say allegedly, because anyone who tried to prove that would be killed alongside. And naturally, they'd pin it on the Christians, their own allies, knowing full well that in revenge, Druze militiamen would kill them in the hundreds. It would give Syria not only the opportunity to raise local tensions, but also the ability to control them. It was a seesaw action meant to slowly decapitate any ethnicity whose leader wasn't theirs to control. Jumblat just happened to be the first. And credit where credit is due, it worked. Even with his son as the new lord of the Druze, the coalition had built would die alongside him. Any hole those Syrians could find, they'd stuff guns and money into until it became a chasm. And so the first to back out were the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the Muslim fascists, Lebanese who, for whatever reason, wished to be annexed by a powerful hard-right Syria. They'd originally opposed Assad, but recently they'd come to realize that his regime had secret intentions very similar to their own, and in Lebanon they could become the assassins that Damascus required. If you asked any foreign intelligence community to point fingers over Jumblat's murder, they would all point to the SSMP. The second to leave would be the PLO, although they'd still often fight alongside the Druze in the battles yet to come. Their real enemy was always Israel, and so beyond what they needed to control West Beirut, they'd send the bulk of their soldiers back to their strongholds in the south, which not everybody was happy about, of course. These were historically Shia lands, and as their Sunni numbers swelled against the border, some members of the PLO began to act like an unstoppable mafia, causing an anger that turned to spite and eventually resistance. From those subjugated Shia would rise a new powerful militia called Amal, a place for Damascus to dump money and guns. It was one part street gang, one part proxy, another little army to help hold back the growing power of the PLO. And with that, the war would see its first major realignment, and the second phase had begun. In the north, under this new ceasefire, Bashir Ismail, son of the founder of the anti-Syrian Kataib militia, would take advantage of the relative calm and begin violently uniting the many Christian fiefs. He dreamed of controlling the Maronites the way the Jumblats controlled the Druze, or as he called it, the unification of the rifle. But it was more like a powerful lord looking to make himself king, or perhaps a capo becoming a don. His aim was nothing less than being the living embodiment of the far-right Christian dream. It's just that to become that, a lot of his fellow Christians were going to have to die. In June of 1978, he'd kill over 40 members of the Frangier clan, then the country's most powerful pro-Syrian Christian dynasty. He'd even kill their heir. Their leader had been the president not 3 years before, and in power, he'd spurned the Kataib. They'd asked for a canton to run autonomously, and Frangier had said no, so they killed his entire family. Which isn't to say that he was any more innocent than they were. He'd gained his own power from the massacre of another competing Christian family back in the 50s. This was feudalism, and their armies were little more than gangs. But naturally, to the Syrians now occupying the country, the killing of their Maronite proxy, the man they'd chosen to become their puppet, was nothing less than a declaration of war. And on July 1st, they'd retaliate. Kataib neighborhoods in East Beirut would see thousands of shells dropped upon their homes. 15,000 troops, including an entire brigade of special forces, would be sent to crush those arrogant Christians. But I suppose they weren't that special, because they would almost immediately lose. They'd be surrounded in such an embarrassing defeat that Syria would be forced to beg the USSR to step in to protect their now tenuous control of Lebanon. They'd even lose a second time trying to siege the city of Zala, all of which would only serve to increase Ismail's power. And now firmly in control, in 1980, he'd commit yet another Christian massacre, wiping out 87 of ex-President Camille Chamoun's Tigers in a single raid. It was genuine gangland politics. But again, credit where credit is due. It would unite those rifles, and by 1981, there was virtually no Maronite left to stand against him. Only back in the south, another war was on the rise, and it too would change the political landscape. In 1977, feeling pressured by America to allow a Palestinian state, Israel would vote in their hardest-right government in all history, Prime Minister Menahem Begin. A man who'd started his career as a literal terrorist. And that's not me saying that. That's Einstein, Churchill, Queen Elizabeth. In fact, until the election that brought him to power, he'd been considered a terrorist by virtually every single country on the planet. Israel would have to do an international campaign of diplomacy just to get him off the lists before he could take office. And yet, even with multiple civilian massacres to his name, he would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for agreeing to do something that Israel had already planned to do. And then, once he got it, immediately reneged on the deal that got it for him, which, if you look at the timeline, makes it rather likely that to even accept that peace prize, he would have had to take time off from secretly planning his war. And now all he had to do was wait for provocation, which came a few months later. In March of 1978, it would be handed to him on a platter exactly as he knew it would be. 11 Palestinians snuck into Israel and hijacked 2 buses full of civilians. Before they could be stopped, they would indiscriminately murder 37 innocent people and injure another 76. It was the purely evil provocation that Begin had been waiting for, the first test of his new right-wing fist, and 4 days later he would invade Lebanon. In just a single week, thousands of Lebanese civilians would be killed, with hundreds of thousands more displaced from their homes. Not just the Palestinians, but also the local Shia, who up until that point had little vested interest in the war. And just 2 years out from the end of their civil war, watching that tenuous Lebanese peace collapsing before their eyes, the UN would demand that Israel return across their border. And for now, they would listen. That said, they wouldn't exactly comply. Israel would still keep their boots on the ground. They'd just fill them with someone else's feet. No longer allowed to send soldiers themselves, they'd support a local Christian paramilitary under the leadership of brutal Lebanese army defector Saad Haddad. With only 5% of the region's population, his Israeli-backed southern Lebanese army would turn him into one of the region's most dangerous warlords. And despite controlling little more than a glorified hit squad, he would declare the South his own independent nation. They would see him branded as a traitor by the authorities in Beirut, but that didn't really mean all too much. They didn't control the South, and the only thing his income was judged on was how much he could punish the Palestinians who did. For the next 4 straight years, Israel's main goal was to provoke the PLO into a response that would free their hands for yet another invasion. And with America protecting them from any true reprisals, even as the southern Lebanese army shot 3 Irish members of the UN peacekeeping force, they only ever increased their pressure. If the international rules no longer allowed them to kill those who were plotting against them, they would simply break those rules. Who better to hunt a terrorist than a terrorist himself? And if those Palestinians ever took the bait, well, they'd invade and kill them. Which wasn't exactly a winning position for the PLO. So in May of 1981, with growing Iraqi, Iranian, and Syrian attempts to destabilize their coalition, not to mention the Christian militias all uniting in Beirut, Arafat began looking for a way out of that trap. At talks in Saudi Arabia, he'd even expressed the first real hints of a willingness to compromise with the UN, perhaps even finding a 2-state solution. Which, to begin, was the moment he'd been waiting for. They weren't at the table if they weren't weak, and so again he'd ramp up that pressure. In July, ostensibly in response to rocket attacks across the border, he'd commit an undeniable war crime and bomb residential Beirut, taking out an apartment building and indiscriminately killing over 300 people, virtually all of them civilians. And again, a ceasefire would be hastily brokered by the UN, but in June of 1982, Iraqi-sponsored assassins under the command of Saddam Hussein, in his own attempt to co-opt the Palestinian cause, would try to murder an Israeli diplomat in London. And again, it was the provocation that Tel Aviv had been waiting for. They downplayed reports of Iraqi involvement to blame the PLO, and then responded with a cross-border killing of over 100 people. When the Palestinians shot back, they called it a violation of the ceasefire and began a pre-planned ground invasion of Lebanon. Again, the UN would tell Israel to return home, but this time, they had no interest in listening. This time, they weren't just going to stop in the south. Virtually every faction of Muslim Lebanon would rise to resist them. The Shia, the Sunni, Palestinians, Druze, all walks of life, all political spectrums. It didn't matter how much they hated each other yesterday. They weren't about to let Israel decide tomorrow. That said, militias can't just stop an army because they're angry, especially the Israeli army. Lebanon is barely an hour drive tip to tip, and that's the long way. Even with the Syrians fully committed against them, it was only a matter of days before their military had Beirut surrounded, and so for the next month, their army would ruthlessly and methodically bomb what were, or what they perceived to be, PLO strongholds in the city. They'd never even send in their soldiers. They'd just sit on the outskirts and bomb. Which, again, credit where credit is due. If the goal was rooting out the PLO, that definitely achieved it. Already in a weak position, this was like hell being brought down on their houses, and it wasn't just their soldiers being killed, it was their mothers, their children, their entire society. Every day, another apartment block destroyed because some intel claimed it contained an office of the PLO, regardless of if that was true or not. And under this hail of bombs, Arafat and his coalition would agree to leave Lebanon just so long as the Israelis left too. They'd even move their headquarters to Tunisia, thousands of kilometers away. But in the eyes of those Israelis, why would they be at the table if they weren't weak? Israel had no interest in letting them escape, especially not now that they got them into a corral. They'd already accepted the bad PR, and now it was time to do the murders. And they were going to do the murders. This wasn't a war, it was a war crime. They pressed forward with those bombs even as every voice worldwide demanded that they take the deal, until finally, eventually, it came from the one that actually mattered. Under American decree, the Israelis would agree to peace and let the PLO leave the country. And to make sure things went smoothly, Reagan would even send an army to oversee it. Just like that, Lebanon would change overnight. The removal of the PLO would create a power vacuum not only in West Beirut, but all across the south, where the Shia had long since been subjugated to the whims of the gun-toting Palestinians. And now, with nearly 80% of the region's population, all they really needed to wrestle back control were some guns of their own, which, just as long as they understood who the real boss was, Hafez al-Assad was more than happy to provide. After all, he was an Alawite, effectively a Shia. And with their new benefactor behind them, by the early 1980s, that rising Shia proxy of Amal would quickly become the country's fastest-growing militia. And rather tellingly, their first enemy wouldn't be the Christians, but the Sunni Palestinians who had for so long held them down. Which meant that for the second time since the start of the war, the political landscape of Beirut would see yet another total realignment. The Christian East consolidating around the unification of Ismail's rifle, and the Islamic West falling into sectarian chaos. The third phase of the Civil War had begun. And with Vietnam now well in the rear view, on August 21st, 1982, an American-led multinational army was sent by Reagan to keep the peace as the PLO withdrew. Invited by the government to help maintain stability, their presence would provide yet another social signal of increasing Maronite control. They presented themselves as neutral observers, but of course no Muslim questioned who America was there to help. And as their warships shelled the Druze on the outskirts of the city, for all their promises, they were looking like just another backer of those butchers in the Kataib. But now at their strongest point since the war began, those united Maronite rifles would overshoot their mark. And on August 23rd, just 2 days after the arrival of their American allies, at perhaps the most sensitive moment in the nation's history, they would elect President Bashir Ismail, anti-Syrian leader of the nation's most powerful Christian militia. Not to mention the one with the most atrocities to its name. This was a man who had killed hundreds of his own people, let alone his enemies. Although saying that makes it sound like he was a bit unique among his peers, and that was clearly not the case. He might have been a murderer, but this was a region of murderers, in a time of murderers. In August of 1982, as he was elected, almost every single regional power was being helmed by a known war criminal. Be it Israel, Syria, the PLO, Iraq, Iran. The only thing holding back any of these monsters were even more powerful monsters. And so it was truly no surprise to anyone that it was less than 3 weeks before he was murdered. Even less surprising that it was Syria who pulled the trigger. Again, allegedly. But if not them, surely it would have been someone. Ismail might have been popular among his Christian bloc, but outside of them, he had long since been marked for death. And yet it wasn't just his enemies who saw him in that future grave, but his allies as well. And sensing that he'd have little time on that throne, it was also a murder that Israel had long since prepared for. Claiming a newfound need for security, they'd reinvade West Beirut, and now removed of all PLO protection with nobody in control but them, their right-wing allies were asked to descend on the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila to do what Tel Aviv couldn't. General of the IDF and future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon would help spur that slaughter, launching flares and blocking the exits while the militias raged inside. His soldiers would sit back and listen to the murder of thousands of innocent civilians without so much as raising a finger. To those Kateb reeling from the death of their most powerful leader in a generation, this horrific massacre might not have exactly been justice, but it sure felt that way. With Bashir in the ground, his brother Amin would be voted in next. Another Ismail president, only this one would be far more cautious about defying Syria. Especially now. Because across the Middle East, major regional changes were reshaping the geopolitical landscape. In 1979, an Iranian revolution had created a new nemesis for the United States and a massive new ally for Syria. By 1982, they'd begun to export that revolution to the disaffected Shia all across the Arab world. And in the early 1980s, nowhere fit that description better than Lebanon. In the south, where both Israel and the PLO had for years treated Shiites as expendable others, there was no shortage of righteous anger to tap into. And so with the blessing of Syria, Iran secretly entered the country and began forming a hyper-religious Shia paramilitary. Their goal, nothing less than the complete removal of all Western influence from the entire Middle East. America, France, Israel, everyone had to go. It was the beginning of a movement that would eventually become known as Hezbollah, and as their entry onto the international stage, they would commit some of the era's most devastating acts of terror. In April of 1983, their suicide bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut would kill over 60 people, including the local head of the CIA. It was enough to convince America that it was time to speed up their endgame, and a month later, Washington would propose a peace treaty. The problem was, to get Israel on board, it had to be a full capitulation, and that was something the Lebanese Muslims would never agree to. So, although on paper it was technically signed, it would be wrong to say it was ever actually real. Even still, Israel and America would stick to their plan. Israeli strongholds would be given back to the Lebanese army, and other than their buffer in the south, they'd leave the rest of the country to what they hoped would effectively be little more than their Christian militia allies. They'd even give themselves the right to return if things didn't go their way, which to a vast majority of the country was completely unacceptable. And so now, with a new cause to use as his center, that son Jumblat would set up a coalition to oppose this humiliating Israeli peace. The Druze, the remaining Palestinians, and even the Syrian army would revolt against this new American order. And when the Lebanese military was sent to restore control, they found a great deal more resistance than they'd expected. Before long, they'd be stalled and even turned back. In West Beirut, sensing the army's weakness, the now powerful Shia of Amal would join the rebellion. In Tyre, they'd even bomb an Israeli headquarters, killing 46. But not to be outdone, in October of 83, the predecessors of Hezbollah would commit 2 successive suicide bombings that would kill nearly 300 soldiers of Reagan's multinational force. Over 250 Americans and 50 French would die in an instant. More Marines than had been killed in a single day since the Second World War. It was an act that would put their names on the map both at home and abroad. A powerful moment in the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Through those 2 bombs, they'd achieve what thousands of soldiers couldn't. America was tapping out. In February of 84, Jumblat's new coalition would push to the outskirts of Beirut and then, with the help of the Shia, successfully assault the city. The Lebanese army would collapse, and alongside them, the supposedly peacekeeping Americans who'd been propping them up. By March, not a single Western soldier would remain in the country, and the checkpoints they'd leave behind would be filled by the Irano-Syrian-sponsored soldiers of Amal and Hezbollah. And yet again, for the 4th time, the war would see a major realignment. The final stage had begun. In 1985, having only just recently together pushed the Americans out of the country, the Shia Amal would turn on their erstwhile Palestinian allies. At the prompting of Damascus, they'd begin a campaign of eradication. If Syria couldn't control the Lebanese-Palestinian interactions with Israel, then they were a threat that shouldn't exist. It was a violence that surged Amal into becoming the most powerful street gang in the country. But at the same time, it drove a wedge straight through their own heart, because not every Shia was willing to fight against the Palestinians, even if they were Sunni, even if Syria told them to. Every nation sings in 1,000 sirens, and Amal could only sing in a few. So, partly out of ideology and partly out of politics, as that primarily Syrian proxy increased their attacks on Palestinians, the primarily Iranian proxy, Hezbollah, stepped in to protect them. By 1988, those 2 powerful Shia militias would be in open conflict in the streets of Beirut, both Syria and Iran preaching calm, but both sides knew they'd back whoever won. They'd call it the Battle of the Brothers, and although neither side would exit having really gained all too much territory, I'd argue that Hezbollah exited the clear winner. Because every time they defended those Palestinians, their cause looked that much more legitimized in the eyes of the Arabs who surrounded them. And now, with virtually no way of stopping any of the violence happening in any corner of their country, the central government all but tapped out of the fight. The lands they ruled were all but destroyed, their militias were puppets, and their army was broken. Even the once powerful Palestinians had been destroyed. And by 1988, Damascus had won. It was a lot more stones than they'd anticipated, but to be fair, it was also a lot more birds. And now, with their hands firmly on the national throat, they were going to oversee the final election of the war. And guess whose candidate was gonna win? But with their backs against the wall, the Christian leaders would rise up and throw a Hail Mary. In September of '88, with just a week left in office, President Ismail would be strong-armed into filling the prime ministership with publicly anti-Syrian Maronite general Michel Aoun. It was a bit like a soft coup, really. Never before had there been a Maronite prime minister. It would instantly break the government, which I suppose was the point. From there, Aoun figured that he could puppet the remains of that Frankenstein state until eventually maneuvering his way into the presidency somehow. But that was never going to happen. The vast majority of the country considered his government illegitimate and elected their own parliament without him. Granted, it was a parliament that was entirely stacked with pro-Syrian voices, but they were, technically, legitimately elected voices. And in November, they would all agree to a peace treaty sponsored by Saudi-backed billionaire Rafiq Hariri. But with that ink dry and the entire nation against him, there really was no way forward for this rebellious Aoun. The only support he had came from George Bush and Saddam Hussein, and all they really wanted was someone who might hurt Iran. Yet even in weakness, he was nothing if not inept, and so in February of '89, he'd declare war on Christian militia leader Samir Geagea, publicly accusing him of being a Syrian puppet for agreeing to that Saudi peace deal. Yet all that really achieved was destroying what was otherwise a relatively untouched Christian enclave. And yet, despite losing to that single Christian militia, a month later, he would declare a farcical war of independence against Damascus. Aoun could deny it all he wanted, but the war was over. Through that Saudi-backed deal, Lebanon's politics would shift in favor of the Muslims. The presidency of the Maronites was weakened, they'd get equal representation in parliament, and their congressional power would be increased. And in turn, there would be no killing. The militias would hand in their weapons and return to a purely political stance. At least that was the plan. But unfortunately, it too would go awry because while everyone else might hand in their guns, one militia would be allowed to keep them. The Syro-Iranian proxy of Hezbollah would be given a special dispensation from their new overlords, and their guns would remain in their hands. In turn, their power inside the country would grow immensely. But that was yet to be clear. And so with the treaty signed, Lebanon set about voting itself a new president, a vision of unity named René Mawad. He was a Maronite pluralist, proposed as the most likely candidate to be able to close the many wounds that had been torn into the corpse of Lebanese society. It's just as part of that unity, he refused to dismiss Prime Minister Michel Aoun. And so 17 days later, Assad would have him killed for it. Again, allegedly. Not surprisingly, however, his successor wouldn't be so defiant. He'd fire him immediately, and while Aoun might deny that new government's legitimacy, before long his clock started blinking zero. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein would invade Kuwait. America would declare war, and in exchange for supporting their invasion, they would give Syria the green light to remove that annoying little general. 2 months later, and Aoun would be bombed into exile in France, demanding his boys hold a valiant last stand as he ran away. With their opposition now in ashes, that new puppet president would sign over the country to Syria completely. It was far more of a capitulation than anything the Israelis had demanded, but there was simply nobody left to fight it. By 1991, independent Lebanon was dead. But this country is a phoenix. And just as soon as those ashes had settled, this ancient people began to rise again. Or at least they'd try. But if Lebanon was a Frankenstein by the 1990s, the only parts of it still working were that head and that one fist, Syria and Hezbollah. For the most part, though, the Lebanese government wasn't really even involved anymore. This was an Iranian-American thing. They were just the battlegrounds. And for the next 35 years, their civil war would continue effectively without their involvement, which politically realigned the country into two pretty obvious camps: those who wanted to rebuild society and the Shia militias. Which kind of makes sense, really, because a sinking tide might lower all ships, but Hezbollah's was tied to an Iranian dock, and so, well, in theory, they were just another subjugated part of the Lebanese mosaic. In practice, they would run their region far more autonomously than Syria had stopped those Christians from doing. The rules simply didn't apply to them. And perhaps more importantly, their budget also didn't rely on Lebanon. It came from Iran, in the form of gold bars, no less, up to $700 million a year. And so to them, it was kind of better if the economy never actually improved at all, especially outside their region, because if anybody else got power, presumably, the first thing that they were going to do would be disarm Hezbollah. And as a horrible side bonus, it was a lot easier to recruit walking corpses if they already lived in a dead world. However, for the rest of the country, fixing the economy was perhaps the only thing left they could focus on that still felt positive. With no real say in the government beyond deciding which dog would sit in the warmest part of Assad's lap, even just a whiff of a better life was the carrot that kept those broken legs walking, and you can fit a lot of hope in a very small place. In Saudi Arabia, they sensed opportunity. Beginning in the late 1980s and solidifying with Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, the Saudi royal family had found themselves as the primary Arab ally of the United States. It was a position that they would use to push that giant empire towards confrontation with their mutual enemies in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Iran. Wars they knew they could never fight alone, and so although their position had long demanded they speak softly in their new friend America, they would find a very big stick. Which, although those Saudis would never say it out loud, aligned them with the furthest right ideologues of Israeli politics. The two sides might never talk to each other directly, but in secret they'd both be very happy to work together as long as it meant pushing the U.S. on that road towards war. In 1991, in exchange for fighting Iraq, the United States would be given the green light to host troops on Saudi soil, a decision that would come back to haunt us all. And so despite becoming one of America's most complete military victories in its 200-year history, the 1991 invasion of Kuwait would signal the beginning of a Middle Eastern Cold War that the U.S. would be drawn into seemingly unaware. It would be a war that would bleed that once great empire to the point of near bankruptcy. But with this giant new ogre to protect them from reprisal, those royals in Riyadh would decide it was time to inject their horse into the great Lebanese race, a man named Rafiq Hariri. To call him corrupt would be like calling water a drink. He only spoke because Riyadh gave him the mic, but at the same time, nobody was really expecting a utopia here. Everybody else was terrible too. All most Lebanese really wanted was a job that paid them more than $5 a day, and for many, this billionaire Hariri seemed like the best guy to get it for them. Or at the very least, the others certainly wouldn't. So running under the name The Future, Hariri turned himself into a national symbol of an unspoken dream. He was the man who could bring back investment, the man who could rebuild downtown. Who knows, maybe, just maybe, he might make things like they were before that hotel caught fire. Maybe Lebanon could be a real country again. And yeah, okay, he was Sunni, but like that great Druze Fakhr al-Din, he'd made a promise to the Christians that their pockets would be lined too. This was a coalition of hope. In 1992, he'd take the prime ministership and begin racking up massive public debts, redeveloping as much of the downtown core as his company Solidaire could snatch up. Of course, every building he'd renovate, he'd get a cut from. This wasn't altruism. He wasn't even giving people cash for their homes, just stock in the company that stole it from them. In any other time, this might have sparked a revolution, but now it was like, take what you can get. At least some stuff got built. It might not have been perfect. In fact, it was far from perfect. But nobody was expecting utopia here. This was a world of silver linings, and the one people found in him was investment. But like with all dreams, eventually you gotta wake up. It's easy to take out loans and get that short-term boost, but it's hard to get real investment in a nation that won't stop going to war. Without an honest peace, without Syria and Israel both packing up and heading home, all those massive loans were going to become an unstoppable problem. It's just unfortunately, at the time, that was the least of their concerns. In the early 1990s, Israel would assassinate Hezbollah's interim leader, and with his death would come the arrival of a far more capable tactician, a force of a man named Hassan Nasrallah. Through him, Hezbollah would change from a few thousand terrorists into a genuine Lebanese social movement. He joined the government and sweep every seat he contested, becoming a shadow administration to nearly a quarter of the country, and that wasn't entirely out of love, mind you. Although he would claim to be a purely political force, it was not a well-kept secret that his assassins would break entire dynasties who pressed back against him. And it wasn't just in Lebanon where he'd changed that calculus. Soon after taking power, Nasrallah would import rockets with a range that made Israel's South Lebanese buffer state virtually irrelevant. All those thousands of innocent people who died to create it, now buried in a no-man's land that didn't even matter. That great invasion of '82, that dream of the Israeli far right, only serving to create a far more capable enemy with an even stronger arsenal. But it's not like Israel could just back down. Imagine the coup that would be for Hezbollah. They'd been there for a decade. Their proxies had done unforgivable things that were definitely going to blow back the second that they left. So if they were going to leave, and that was still a big if, the only acceptable way to do it would be to leave with strength. Every member of Hezbollah would have to be killed on their way out the door, if not physically, at least politically. And that meant 3,000 people hiding among 1.5 million, give or take. It would be like trying to find hay in a needle stack. The only real way to achieve it, in the eyes of the Israeli military, would be restarting the civil war. Let the Christians do to Hezbollah what they'd once done to the PLO, because it wasn't like the locals didn't know who they were, they just weren't talking. So in July of 1993, they'd launch Operation Accountability. It was a message carved onto a bullet and shot into the walls of those turtled Christian elite. If they were going to let Hezbollah into the government to represent the nation, that made them the nation. That made everything a target. And if you didn't like that, well, kick them out. It was a message that, according to the Israeli tacticians, was best sent as a flood of refugees. The third publicly stated goal of that Israeli operation was to overwhelm Beirut with Shia migrants. By filling the city with destitute Southerners, they'd hoped to see that same Christian anger that had come 20 years before. But this wasn't 20 years before. And of course the Christians rejected it. It might have well have been suicide, both physically and politically. These weren't some foreign fighters coming from abroad. They were homegrown Lebanese fighting for their country's freedom. This was now 10 years into an Israeli occupation. Even if they wanted to kick them out, which many people did, Syria would crucify them for saying it. Not a single Christian leader would take that risk. But then again, neither would Syria. And even on the whiff of a potential coalition against them, they'd have Samir Geagea, the only truly independent Christian leader remaining, imprisoned for crimes committed during the war. Which, in fairness, he absolutely did commit, but of all the hundreds who'd done the same, only he'd be targeted, and it isn't complicated to guess why. But even if Gege had remained free, neither the Christians nor the Lebanese government had any real way of stopping Hezbollah, and Israel knew that. For the most part, this was all just a PR exercise to explain why the conflict was being expanded again. It's a hard sell, the idea of a generations-long proxy war with Iran, but everybody understands if you say Lebanon won't rein in their terrorists, especially since that was 100% true. Yet, to put it bluntly, if Israel wanted Hezbollah destroyed, this couldn't have been a dumber move. The only people who saw it as anything but a mistake were the Israelis undertaking it, and soon enough, even they'd be forced to change their tune. Because Operation Accountability turned Hezbollah from a regional militant group into a genuine social cause. When something was destroyed by an Israeli bomb, it was Hezbollah who'd show up to help, not the Lebanese government. If you lost your home, you could expect a stack of crisp, fresh American dollars flown straight in from Tehran. To quote former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, "When we entered Lebanon, there was no Hezbollah. We were accepted with perfumed rice and flowers. It was our presence there that created them." By 1995, the PLO might have been quiet, but man, Hezbollah certainly weren't. Trained and armed by Iranian special forces, they now had better soldiers, more rockets, money, and influence than any who had come before, and they were quickly becoming a greater challenge to Israel than even the most dedicated of the Palestinians. The trajectory of their rise was clear. To the average Israeli, it must have been like watching your government start a grease fire only to follow it up with a bucket of water, because in 1996 they'd invade again. They'd claim it was a response to rocket attacks, because there were always rocket attacks, so in a sense that was true, but the real reason was politics. The country was facing a revolution from its right. The previous prime minister had agreed to a two-party state and then been assassinated by Israeli extremists for doing so. Things were, to put it lightly, tense. Yet in the accords that followed, the PLO would do exactly what that right wing had feared and agree to hang up their guns. They would form into the supposedly nonviolent Palestinian Authority, and Arafat would even pretend to hand power to a successor. It wasn't everything, but it was a strong first step towards peace, and in return, slowly but eventually, Israel would remove all those extremists they'd placed above the tank routes from Jordan, those who overlooked the Palestinian towns with malice in their hearts. Someday soon, they might even be able to remove that netting that covered the streets of their markets, no longer having to catch all the stones and garbage that were hailed down on them from above. For many Israelis, the two-state solution would be a welcome attempt to solve what they saw as an endless cycle of pain and death that would only end in their national destruction, an escape hatch meant to stop themselves from becoming the golem that they'd long feared. But for many others, it would be a betrayal of the very destruction that had led to their country's existence in the first place. To sign that document defied the nation's most important principle: you never back down. So the government of Israel knew it was now or never. If they didn't win this election, they could kiss that two-state solution goodbye. And with their polls looking terrible and their image tainted by weakness, that center-left government decided to show a bit of chutzpah, and they went at the throat of Hezbollah. Operation Grapes of Wrath was a week-long campaign that would backfire so spectacularly it would change your life. You, sitting there watching this right now. Because on day 7 of that PR-inspired onslaught, the IDF would deliberately shell a UN bunker outside the Lebanese village of Kana. The townspeople had all run there with their children to hide from the bombs, but the IDF would hit them with a shot so perfect, you can imagine the operator yelling "bullseye." In 2021, they'd make the guy who ordered that shelling prime minister. 107 completely innocent people. Not Hezbollah, just women and children huddling in a room that the entire world promised was safe. Israel would claim that the civilians had been shooting rockets at them, but when that lie fell apart, they'd claim it was an accident and they had no idea the UN was even there. But that too would be exposed as a lie. Eventually, it became clear that they were watching the entire thing from a drone hovering overhead, and they made the guy who pulled the trigger prime minister. Yet we are all living in that recoil. In Saudi Arabia, a radicalized son of wealth named Osama bin Laden would capitalize on the international trauma of Qana to draw in young, fanatical Sunnis who wanted to fight back against what they saw as increasing Western barbarism. He'd begun his crusade in the 80s with training from the Pentagon, but their alliance was never meant to last, and by the early 1990s, his protege had bombed the World Trade Center, and he was quickly becoming America's enemy number one. Like many fundamentalists of his time, his work was clearly inspired by what was happening in South Lebanon. The suicide bombers that Hezbollah had sent against Reagan's multinational force were the direct inspiration for the creation of al-Qaeda, and from their framework he'd begun putting together a coalition of Sunni terrorists who could put those Shia to shame. Everybody could already tell that this new era was leaning towards fundamentalism, and so in bin Laden's mind, whoever could take that halo was probably also going to get the crown. Nasser was dead, and so was secularism. The armies of the Arabs had all fought, and they had all failed. If the Middle East was going to unite, it was going to unite around God. And if Israel was going to be pushed out, it would be pushed out by boys wearing vests. That was just the vibe the era was giving off. But in this new fundamentalist arms race, by the time of that massacre in Qana, it was clear that the Shia had taken a commanding lead. When the Americans were pushed out of Lebanon, it was the Shia who did it. When the Palestinians needed a protector, it was the Shia who'd come to their aid. And when Israel went to war, it was the Shia who faced their bombs. In the streets, beneath their gaudy thrones, Sunni authority was being undermined all across the region, and bin Laden aimed to fix that. Perhaps just as importantly, however, the failure of Qana would mean that the Israeli left would lose their election, and in from that historic loss would step neo-fascist Benjamin Netanyahu, a supposed counter-terrorism expert who'd come into office with some very clear plans for terrorism. Once in power, Bibi, as he's often known, would waste no time in secretly undermining the two-state solution. Not in public, granted. 75% of the country still wanted it, not to mention Bill Clinton, although it's safe to say he'd become a bit compromised. On paper, however, Bibi would have to continue moving that process forward, and yet, behind the scenes, in every possible way, he'd begin tearing out the bones from the inside. When the U.S. brought him in to sign the next treaty on that road towards peace, Netanyahu responded that the deal was off the table unless they released a Mossad agent caught spying on the U.S. government. A few months later, he'd declare the whole thing illegitimate anyway, and naturally, he'd blame the Palestinians. But that was not all he would do with his time in office. Bibi had a second plan to stop that Palestinian state, something a little bit closer to his heart. And so at the exact same time that Israel was declaring war against the terror in the north, in the south, in the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu and his friends would ask Qatar to secretly fund Palestinian Sunni fundamentalist groups. To paraphrase the words of Netanyahu himself, it would maintain a separation in Palestinian society. It was an organization that would eventually become known as Hamas. To quote a different member of that same government, the policy was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a burden and Hamas as a benefit. It would hit many birds, that one stone. Allowing Hamas to rise came with the added bonus of creating an enemy that looked far more murderable to foreigners. A beaten people holding a white flag are hard to position as the bad guy, but to the casual viewer of the world's news, it's far less of a problem if those murders happen to an angry, anti-American, Iranian-sponsored Muslim extremist. Plus, if you put them in charge of the government, then everybody kind of works for them, right? Then everybody's Hamas. And you couldn't really do that with the Palestinian Authority. So while Israel might never have given them a penny themselves, while they might never have sent a single man to bolster those numbers, anyone who opposed Hamas in Gaza would be hindered by the government, sometimes even destroyed. Hamas, however, would not be touched. They'd be given thousands of work permits, sending their people into Israel to make the money that would fund their rise. And as craven as it was, by the early 2000s, it was a plan that had started to bear its rotten fruit. But elsewhere, things were spiraling with a little less control. On May 24th of the year 2000, the Israeli left would briefly retake the government and pull their armies out of Lebanon, finally ending that 18-year occupation. And of course, Hezbollah would overrun the areas they'd leave behind, murdering any of the proxy militiamen that happened to stick around. They'd even show on television their entire operation assassinating the head of the SLA. It was an unbelievable propaganda victory. They hadn't just kicked America out, they'd kicked out Israel too. And it wasn't just Nasrallah's supporters who appreciated that. To many in the north, that news rang out like a gift from God. The war might actually be ending. If Israel left, then Hezbollah didn't need the guns. Syria could leave. Voting might actually mean something again. It was the moment that they'd all been waiting for, and so with opportunity knocking, that Saudi proxy Rafiq Hariri stepped back into the light and the prime ministership. It's just, this wasn't actually a gift from God. It was a gift from Hassan Nasrallah. And you know what? He didn't think the war was over, actually. Sure, Israel went home, but they didn't go home enough. He'd declare the Israeli-occupied Sheba Farms as integral Lebanese territory and then strong-armed the central government into agreeing with them, because technically it was. That part was true. It just wasn't worth the government fighting over. But Nasrallah needed a legal basis for what he was about to do, and in this little sliver of land, he'd find it. Until it was free, he'd say. He'd keep his guns, thanks. It was a decision that would only further be entrenched when a few months later the Camp David Accords broke down, Arafat declared war, and Israel responded by voting back in their far right. Only now, instead of Netanyahu, the Hydra came under the name Ariel Sharon, a war criminal who'd overseen the worst and least justified slaughter of civilians in the entire Lebanese conflict, a slaughter 10 times the size of the bombing in Qana. And he was no more open to a second state than Bibi had been. His election both reflected and created the tensest internal moment that the Israeli people had faced since their independence. The peace talks had failed, Palestinians were coming for their blood, and the two-state solution now seemed like it was falling forever out of reach. And it was in this moment of boiling point pressure that, as part of his election campaign, this new, hard-right military prime minister decided it was time to light a match. With about 1,000 bodyguards, he entered the holiest place in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, a place that virtually every Palestinian considers to not just be religiously sacred, but also the most recognizable symbol of their nation. To them, Al-Aqsa is more than just a mosque. It's more than just where Muhammad's soul went to heaven. It is the very core of their people. To Sharon, however, it was just a way to poke the bear. The entire exercise was a giant public relations statement showing his people that the two-state solution was never going to work. If they were going to live together, as the agreement implied, those Muslims were going to have to accept that Jews could visit that Temple Mount just as much as they could. It might be the third holiest site in Islam, but in Judaism, it was by far the first. But that said, it wasn't like he wanted equality. This wasn't about justice. He was trying to drive a wedge between the Muslim extremists who this would force to violence and the average Palestinian still hoping for peace. His visit would exacerbate an already deadly situation and in turn lead to 5 straight years of crushed Palestinian uprisings. They call it the Second Intifada, which from Sharon's end was exactly what he had set out to do. Hamas took power in Gaza, Palestinians were splintered, and the average Israeli citizen no longer voted for a two-state solution. They even got to build a wall. But elsewhere, things were also seeing some rather dramatic changes, and on June 10th of that same year, Hafez al-Assad, 30-year dictator and longest-serving leader of independent Syria, would die in office. The intent had been for his eldest son Bassel to take power, but perhaps that golden knight should have stuck to horses because a car crash killed him in 1994. His brother would be given the throne instead, a man named Bashar. but it was not built for him. Bashar al-Assad did not have the skills of his father, nor, for that matter, his brother. In his job prior to being dictator, he was fitting people for contact lenses, and yet he couldn't even look them in the eye when he spoke. Nobody would have mistaken him for a natural leader. But for all that he didn't have, he did have one very important piece of the puzzle. He was willing to kill anybody at any time for any reason. And so despite his wormy exterior, people would respect him, even if they had to do it from under some dirt. Yet even still, from the beginning of his reign, it was clear that Bashar would not command the same respect as those who'd come before. And sensing that weakness, the powers that surrounded Syria would begin to constantly test this new fail-son's resolve, especially once those Saudis got their ogre back. In September of 2001, the United States would face a moment of reckoning they almost didn't believe was possible. An extreme form of Sunni terrorism beyond anything America had even fathomed, striking the very buildings that their predecessors had attacked just 8 years before. That first strike didn't get America's attention, but the second one certainly did. And what's more, despite all the propaganda to pretend it didn't happen, just like in the 80s, this purely evil destruction would achieve exactly what it set out to do. In 2003, barely 15 months after they were attacked, America would remove its troops from Saudi Arabia. And just like with Hezbollah before them, that victory would scream across the Middle East like a statement in the clouds, in the corner of every mind, that nagging realization that it worked. It worked in Lebanon and it worked in Saudi. 800 men had done what a 1,000,000-man army couldn't. On their end, however, America was not experiencing this clarity of purpose. They were swinging somewhat blind. The hijackers had primarily been Saudi, their leader Egyptian. One of them was Lebanese, so who do you attack? The military had just been written a blank check, and there were more fish to fry than just al-Qaeda, so why not take the opportunity? America would enter Afghanistan in 2001, Yemen in 2002, and Iraq in 2003. The stated line was that they'd invaded over weapons of mass destruction, but that turned out to be a rather embarrassing lie. The common joke at the time was that the only proof America could find of WMDs were the receipts from when they'd sold them to them. Most cynics would respond that it was actually about their oil, but that was no more correct than the WMDs. The main objective, as would be stated very clearly by the following Republican nominee for president, was to bomb Iran. And for Bashar al-Assad, only just in his first few years of power, that was basically like watching the future written before his eyes, and what's worse, it was a future he would not survive. To stay in power, he needed Iranian guns, and for those guns to flow best, the road through Iraq had to remain open. Shutting that down wouldn't just mean the end of a Shia-led Syria, but also the end of Hezbollah. It might even be the end of Hamas. And so naturally, that was America's main goal. That little strip of land would be convinced towards revolution, the local Kurds bearing the brunt of this new American adventurism. In 2004, they'd begin an uprising, the Israeli-US-Saudi coalition's first real attempt at destabilizing Assad. But the country wasn't yet ready for that chaos, and they'd be crushed and broken. Yet, as a statement, it said everything it had to. The axe was coming. And so scrambling in fear, Assad started to make some very serious mistakes, the first of which would happen here at this exact spot in downtown Beirut. On February 14th, 2005, a truck packed full of explosives evaporated ex-Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. The explosion was so large that they couldn't even find the bomber's DNA. The message could not have been clearer. The future was dead, and Hezbollah had killed it. Immediately, without any prompting, all sectors of Lebanese society revolted against the murder. Every single corner that wasn't bought and paid for by Iran took to the streets in anguish. This wasn't killing a man. It was killing the very promise that things could get better. And now, who was left to even save them, if not themselves? They call it the Cedar Revolution. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the streets. The power of a people united. And within weeks, Assad would agree to pull back his soldiers. The occupation was over. Lebanon would finally be free. But again, Hezbollah would say no. To remain on top, to make sure that nobody ever checked who killed that now martyred hero, they would commit a widespread assassination campaign that would silence dozens of important anti-Syrian voices. On June 2nd, they'd kill Samir Kassir, a columnist who wasn't willing to toe the line. On the 19th, a newspaper editor. 2 days later, they'd kill the head of the Communist Party, and on July 12th, the defense minister. On December 12th, they'd assassinate another editor, and in the following November, they'd kill Pierre Ismail, not just some parliamentarian, but the grandson and namesake of the founder of the Kataib. In 2007, they'd murder 2 more MPs. And credit where credit is due, they kept power all right. Even Hariri's son Saad would have to bend the knee. He'd pretend that the witnesses who'd seen Hezbollah kill his father were fakes, and with it his coalition would collapse. Because if he wasn't willing to stand up for his dad, why should they? But of course he had no choice. He knew he'd eat a bullet for it. And yet as those corpses started to pile, the vultures came to feed. And with Syria on the back foot for the first time since the 80s, Israel saw their moment and struck. The public claim was that it was a response to Hezbollah kidnappings in the Sheba farms, but leaked documents showed it had been planned with the United States months in advance. It wasn't a response to Hezbollah, it was a response to Syria. Assad was weak, the road to Iran was cut, and it was time to see what they might make of things. But the IDF was not prepared for what they'd face here. These were not the Fedayeen of the PLO. They weren't even the Hezbollah of just a few years before. And having caught them off guard with this unexpected assault, Nasrallah turned his tactics towards attrition. He knew that death affected their morale far more than his, so he didn't fear the blindness, just so long as he could take out an eye with him. And so as that invasion mounted, the IDF started to see a lot of bad numbers very early on, the sort of numbers that scare a government. Yet in public, they'd talk a big game about their success. It was everything they'd aimed to achieve, they'd claimed. The U.S. wasn't so sure, though. As far as their experts could tell, the IDF had only taken out 100 of Hezbollah's 12,000 launch platforms. And that was after 170,000 shells. They'd shot so many bombs into Lebanon that they'd almost run out. So what were they shooting? Well, just like they'd promised back in 1993, this was a war of destruction. Just not of Hezbollah. Israel was right. Their bombs had been very successful. Not a single piece of infrastructure had been spared. The airport, the seaports, the power plants, the bridges, the roads, the fuel storage, the water treatment, the sewage plant, hundreds of schools, tens of thousands of homes. Everything you need to run a state, they bombed into ruin. In 34 days, they did more damage to Lebanon than 20 years of civil war. And again, their brutality would shock the world, as if some historical echo in that same village they'd made famous 10 years before, in the dead of night on July 30th, 2006, the IDF would deliberately target a 3-story residential building that contained precisely 0 Hezbollah fighters. Even in their most rabid propaganda, they'd only been able to claim a single one. But it did, however, contain 50 other sleeping people, mostly children, all of whom would die. Although not right away, granted. The first bomb ripped through the ceiling, but for the most part it didn't actually kill them. It sure did wake them up, though. Gave them just enough consciousness to recognize what was happening when those uniformed murderers dropped what was popularly known as a double tap. It's a war crime commonly employed by the IDF to kill those who come to help the wounded. In their mentality, people who would save Hezbollah are no different than Hezbollah. Plus, they're probably medics, and human infrastructure is by far the most important to remove. Horror beget more horror. And just as the IDF had hoped, in the midst of all their destruction, the situation in Lebanon started to fall back towards civil war. In 2008, Druze leader Walid Jumblat noticed that Hezbollah had aimed a secret camera at part of the airport that politicians use, which in his mind meant that they were thinking about assassinating him as well. In a rare moment of candor, he'd accuse Hezbollah in public of trying to kill Lebanon's remaining leaders, which for anyone but Jumblat, saying those words out loud would have been an immediate death sentence. But they couldn't just declare war on the Druze. And yet Nasrallah had been insulted, and that required at least some response. So despite their ideology claiming they would never attack another Muslim, he would focus his revenge on Jumblat's ally, Saad Hariri, or I suppose more accurately, his Sunni supporters in Beirut and Tripoli. For 16 months, they'd fight it out in the streets, but no matter how righteous a son is in avenging his father, Nasrallah had a murder squad and Saad Hariri didn't. His followers would pack their jackets full of explosive and step right up in your face when they died, and Hariri, for all his Saudi billions, just couldn't beat that. And so by 2009, it was clear his only choices were to back down or die. And so he backed down. After 4 long years, the once promising Cedar Revolution was officially over, and Lebanon remained in the grip of al-Assad. Just not for long. In 2011, in response to an uprising in Tunisia where a fruit salesman set himself on fire, the people of Syria would also rise in revolution, and through them, that Iranian-Saudi Cold War would spark what would become its hottest flame. American, Turkish, Saudi, and even secretly Israeli-backed militants would rise not just against the oppressions of this failed dictator, but the entire standing order of the Middle East. And just like with everywhere else, this new incoming ideology was not some pan-Arab secularism, it was Islamic fundamentalism. In Lebanon, that would mean yet another huge change to the political landscape, because millions of people would be forced to flee from that vicious ophthalmologist, and Lebanon would be where they flooded to the most. This country would take in Syrian refugees in numbers no other nation can even contemplate. In a country of just 5 million people, they would see an influx of 1.5 million Syrians. That's a quarter of the population, twice as many people as left Palestine in total during the entire Nakba. But there was no place for them here. There were no jobs for them. The Lebanese didn't necessarily hate them as people, but their presence did inspire a great deal of hate. You can't just add 1.5 million refugees to an already fragile state. Sure, the UN had promised to send money to compensate, but of course it would never be enough. And to make it all worse, the government had basically stopped existing. Everything that still happened in Parliament after Hariri's assassination only did so because some politician was ripping it off. There were no leaders, just pigs devouring what little slop still remained. But none of those swine would be quite as greedy as that once-upon-a-time rebel Michel Aoun. In 2005, Lebanon had declared all fighters from the Civil War forgiven for their crimes, and from France would return that famous ex-militant, that supposedly patriotic general who'd once fought a last-ditch effort against the Syrian invaders. He who'd commanded his men to fight to the death as he ran away. And now he'd return to Lebanon and be bribed by those very same Syrians. Just as long as he got the presidency, he'd let Assad and Hezbollah keep running the country around him, less like a puppet and more like a ghost. Which, as you might imagine, did not make for a particularly good presidency. In fact, it is often stated from all sides that he has been the worst president that Lebanon has ever had, and that is a pretty wide field to choose from. His son-in-law and heir apparent is commonly referred to as the country's most hated person. He's even listed in the Magnitsky Act, which is a pretty big statement considering it was only supposed to be for Russians. Aoun's betrayal of his nation would cast doubts on everything he'd done before. And while he'd retain his position among a small Christian voting bloc, everyone else would consider him little more than a disease. Whispers even started forming that his first attempt to cast off those Syrians had only come because they'd promised him the presidency if he used the army to fight the Christians, and then reneged on it when he actually did it. In the 90s, that would have been a fringe conspiracy theory, but by the 2000s, it had started to make sense. And so by the 2010s, the nation had seen virtually nothing but evil and selfish governments stealing anything that wasn't nailed down. The future was dead. And at this point, all they could really hope for was that their garbage might get picked up. But even that was too much for these criminals who ruled them. And so with their disgusting, uncollected bins now lining every street, again, the people of Lebanon would rise in revolution. But of course, as ever, Hezbollah would say no. And by now, it was probably too late anyway. With the country in open revolt, with no vision of the future but more collapse, that final peg holding up what was an otherwise already fake economy just crumbled to dust. Every single bank collapsed. The lira collapsed. Within days, even if you still could take out your money, what was it worth? Within months, entire lives had been wiped to nothing. It started in August, and by the end of that year, the entire economy of the country was gone. As a comparison, during the worst of COVID, the GDP worldwide dropped around an average rate of 3.4%. Countries that got hit really bad saw that number rise to about 8%. Within a single year, the GDP of Lebanon dropped 60%. And now, unable to pay their bills, every single government service would simply disappear. With no currency to pay their employees, the power company couldn't keep their lights on. With no money to buy gas, they couldn't even run the generators. If you were lucky, you'd get electricity for around 2 hours a day, but even that was no guarantee. The hospitals, schools, police, all of them would go unpaid. Government salaries would drop from a starvation level to a literal joke. The pay you'd make working an entire day at your job wouldn't even cover the cost of the gas it took to drive there. Police would see their salaries cut to between $50 and $150 a month, if they were lucky. And it's not like the prices were low. If you went into a restaurant, they wouldn't even list them. There was no point. By the end of the day, it would have already doubled. Within 6 months, a quarter of the nation's GDP would come from money sent abroad. Within a year, it would be a third. For those who couldn't leave or find a job that paid in a foreign currency, that collapse would leave them completely bankrupt. Rags in the street bankrupt. And even if they worked, the currency that they were paid in wouldn't even be worth their time. But thanks to Assad, no matter how low the pay, no job would go without labor, because with 1.5 million refugees, there was always someone desperate enough to say yes. And yet the hits just kept on coming. In February 2020, just 6 months after their economy collapsed, the world entered a multi-year pandemic. The nurses here already had no salaries, the hospital no electricity. Surely this must be the bottom, because really, how much worse could things even get? Well, on August 4th, 2020, a small fire would break out in the grain silos that lined the country's most vital port. Since 2013, they'd been used to store nearly 3,000 tons of abandoned ammonium nitrate. Nobody was even paying to store it anymore. The company that had put it there had long since gone bankrupt, and the ship that brought it in was sunk outside the port, so for 7 straight years it had just sat there rotting. At 5:45, the first reports came in of a flame. A team of 10 firefighters would be dispatched to put it out. Heroes. All 10. At 6:07 came the first explosion, 2 tons of TNT, the size of the Oklahoma City bombing, and yet that was nothing a blip compared to what was coming. 40 seconds after that initial explosion came a destruction unrivaled in modern times. I struggle to even describe it. The father of all bombs is the single most destructive non-nuclear weapon ever created. It contains about 45 tons of TNT. They calculated the explosion that rocked Beirut's harbor at nearly 1,000 tons. It was the 6th largest non-nuclear explosion in all recorded history in the downtown of a capital city. That second explosion was so large they could feel it in Cyprus, hundreds of kilometers away. It blew out the windows of the airport on the complete opposite side of Beirut. Over 200 people would be killed in an instant. The hospitals, already understaffed and overwhelmed by COVID, would now face an influx of injured they couldn't possibly manage. An absolutely purposeless atrocity. It's a day that none in the country will ever forget. But Lebanon is a phoenix. Not 10 minutes after that explosion, and the entire city of Beirut was in the streets with a broom. They didn't fight each other, they didn't loot, they cleaned up the glass. And then they placed those shards that were once their city into the overflowing piles of garbage that their useless government had long left to rot in their streets. And again, the people cried for revolution. How dare these elites, with their money from abroad, with their billions, with their castles, how dare they show their faces? They ruined everything. It was so abundantly clear that these corrupt beasts would never stop squeezing the throat of this already dead motherland. And so with those brooms still in hand, they would sweep and sweep until they'd swept out the government, that mob of humanity coming from all walks of life, every corner of Lebanon, together organically demanding that every single person in power quit. But again, Hezbollah would hold the line. If you wanted them gone, you'd have to come and make them. They'd even shoot Lockman Slim in the face just for suggesting otherwise. But this was not 2005, and their position was nowhere near what it had once been. Outside the country, the situation had turned. In 2022, the main arms producer for their Shia coalition would begin to bleed to death in the factories of Ukraine, and with their army stripped bare and not enough manpower to even fight their own conflict, Russia would back away from their allies in Africa and the Middle East. They'd even be forced into importing Iranian drones just to sustain their assault, and that weakness did not pass unnoticed. With their allies in chaos, the dictatorship of Iran was dying on its feet. Oil prices had plunged, the country had run out of water, and they'd even had their own Kurdish revolution to suppress. By 2023, that Shia alliance had never been weaker, and Saudi Arabia, under a new Western-friendly regime, would even start making overtures that they were willing to accept Israel as a real country, change that Facebook status to "It's complicated," which was a symbol in and of itself that Israel was starting to be seen as a permanent presence in the region, or, put in other terms, that the wave of fundamentalism had both crested and was starting to crash. If you'd asked what the biggest story in the Middle East was on October 6th, 2023, pretty much everyone would have told you that it was Israeli-Saudi normalization. MBS had just finished a campaign of mass repression, and now he was going to redefine the entire region around his new personal form of ostensibly Sunni dominance. He'd turn a luxury hotel into a prison for his relatives, and then those who tried to run, he'd quite literally shoot out of the sky. He'd even call Saad Hariri all the way from Beirut just to imprison him and demand he kiss the ring. Under MBS, the Saudi government would turn towards a semi-secular dictatorship soaked in the blood of those who refused it. His Islam would be a capitalist Islam, and his power the ogre's power. A new era of bribery had taken hold in Washington, and nobody bribes better than the House of Al Saud. Not that others wouldn't try. In Gaza, Hamas would have every reason to be concerned. This was as dangerous a situation as they had ever faced, and so sensing their window of opportunity closing, they would move forward with a plan that had been in the making for quite some time. On October 7th, 2023, soldiers of Hamas would attack the Israeli people in a horrific single-day assault. It was an unignorable act of terror, meant not just to kill and kidnap as many civilians as their army could get their hands on, but also to inflict a wave of death back onto their own people that could shock the world into action. As awful as that martyrdom that it would inspire would no doubt be, by invoking the wrath of the IDF, Hamas surely understood that the brutality that it would inflict would tear open a chasm between the plans of this new Saudi king and the greater Islamic world he hoped to lead. Which on his end was like music to Bibi's ears. His long-standing dream of mass ethnic cleansing being handed to him exactly as he'd planned it 3 decades before. This was a generational opportunity for murder. His enemies had never at any point been weaker, physically or politically. And even better, his allies had never been more bribed or blackmailed into submission. Even as it started to become clear that this was not about rooting out Hamas, even as the defense minister described Palestinians as, quote, animals, even as the ICC issued a warrant against their leaders for what had become undeniable war crimes, the Western world would only ever increase their support. Yet surely even Hamas would have been unprepared for just how destructive this response would be. In Gaza, the Israeli military would commit more publicly documented war crimes in a shorter period of time than in almost any other conflict ever recorded. And that's just the parts we know about. Information has not exactly been easy to obtain here. They'd kill journalists in numbers we've never seen before. Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than have died in almost every single American war since 1910 combined, and they did it within a single year. Yet the international press barely even noticed. From the moment the war began, with a flip of a switch, the Israeli government would cut all Gaza's electricity, food, fuel, and water. They'd shut down all telecommunications and stop all incoming aid. They'd control every single facet of daily life since before the war began, and they even had the walls to prove it. But it was okay, because they were Hamas. According to leaked numbers from the IDF, at least 83% of all Palestinian dead have been civilians. That's the best case scenario. Even worse, children account for more than half. That means that in this one attack on Gaza alone, nearly 15 times as many children have been killed as all Israeli civilians in total since their nation's inception. Not just from Palestinians, but from all Arab sources. 15 times as many children as all their dead from 1948 until today combined. Even if you include all Israeli soldiers, all their wars, every single conflict they've ever faced as a nation, the children killed in this one attack alone nearly doubles that number. It is a horror that very few of us have even begun to conceptualize, but to paraphrase a leaked audio of the former head of Israeli military intelligence, the Palestinians need a Holocaust every now and then. But it's okay, because they're Hamas. Netanyahu would repeat in the world's press as much as he could that the war was purely over the release of the hostages. He would say that Hamas are the new Nazis, and the foreign press would repeat those words verbatim. But within Israel itself, that story was very different. The families of those kidnapped stated many times that they did not believe that Netanyahu was actually trying to get their hostages back. They would consider themselves and their loved ones pawns meant to unshackle the government's fists. And when the first hostages released spoke of good treatment by their captors, the government immediately set about silencing them. Even after the final few were handed over, Israel's bombs would not stop falling on Gaza. To anyone paying attention, it was clear from the beginning that the goal was always liquidation, if not the people, certainly the infrastructure. Members of Netanyahu's government would even speak of it as a, quote, real estate bonanza, their publicly stated dream, nothing less than the total resettlement of the entire strip. They even got Trump to demand it. And so by September of 2025, 92% of all Gazan houses would be destroyed. 92% of all schools, 88% of all shops, 89% of all water treatment plants, 125 hospitals, over 1,700 healthcare workers alongside them. Instead of just double taps, when bombing Gaza's hospitals, the IDF had started dropping a third. Rescue crews learned to wait for the second, so if you really wanted to kill them, you'd have to drop a third. Alongside those bombs, they'd start a campaign of black bagging. 28 doctors would be kidnapped and jailed without trial, dragged from their hospitals, ambulances, and even their homes. They've been held in Israeli prisons for what is now nearly 800 days. 2 have died. And they're joined by thousands of others who are being held without ever having been charged with a crime. To call it a genocide is both true and also still somehow underselling the case. But this is a story about Lebanon, so let's jump back up north. The crisis in Gaza gave Hezbollah no good options. They didn't want to join. The country around them was rioting. Just to keep a hand on the reins of power, they'd even had to restart the assassination campaign. But weak or not, they had to do something. What would it say if they didn't? And so for Nasrallah, ever the tactician, that meant the bare minimum. A little yelling on TV and launching some rockets into the Sheba farms. It was a statement to Israel that he didn't want this fight. Not now, anyway. And again, to Netanyahu, that was the music he'd been looking to hear, because it didn't matter what they did. This was a trap that had already sprung. Mossad had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, and now, unshackled by the brutality of that attack from Hamas, there was nothing Nasrallah could do but face the wrath of that incoming Israeli fury. The IDF turned north and began their second front. The beginning of the 2024 invasion of Lebanon was undeniably a war crime. The Israeli Secret Service had sold Hezbollah thousands of bombs that they'd inserted into a wide variety of electronics, the most well-known, of course, being pagers. Pagers that were then handed to virtually every major figure in that organization, which included, quite tellingly, Iran's ambassador to Lebanon. But it wasn't just pagers. It was walkie-talkies, air conditioning units, anything they could get a bomb inside, they'd put a bomb inside. And starting on September 18th, those electronics would all explode. At least 42 people would be killed, some of whom would be innocent bystanders, some of whom would be children. Thousands more would be injured alongside, and obviously not all of them were Hezbollah. But at the same time, a bunch of them were. And when compared to a conventional bombing campaign, the numbers were about as good as you'd ever get. If you discount that it defied all the legal and moral codes that have been instilled since the Second World War, it was among the single most effective intelligence operations in the history of the world. And so, credit where credit is due, if the goal was to get rid of Hezbollah, that was a pretty effective way to do it. Certainly better than anything they'd done before, at least. Much like those Shia suicide bombings had once been towards them, this new form of illegal warfare followed none of the rules and got all the results. Combined with their standard bombing campaign and constantly being fed secrets from the country's poorest and most broken people, those Israelis would effectively root out the entire leadership of Hezbollah within a week. Something they'd been looking to do for 30 straight years. And again, the rest of Lebanon would attempt to capitalize on that weakness. In January of 2025, with Hezbollah broken and America lurking in the shadows, Lebanon elected a new government. The president would come from the army and run on the promise of full disarmament, which, given that they were the only ones left with any guns, obviously meant Hezbollah. His statement, as he so diplomatically put it, was that the army of Lebanon alone would kick out the Israelis. It was something that just a year before would have likely got him killed. But now Hezbollah didn't have much choice. They weren't exactly in a position to fight, so they let him live. And the pressure continued. Just as soon as they signed the ink to let him into power, that new president would install Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, a judge on the International Court of Justice. A single year ago, and he too would have been killed just for his resume alone, but the moment he took his seat, he did what Hezbollah had killed so many to stop and restarted the inquiry into who murdered Rafiq Hariri. Hezbollah's response was to say that they were making a, quote, major sin, which doesn't sound particularly innocent. But Israel themselves weren't exactly making it easy for that new president to fulfill his promise. In just over a year since declaring the ceasefire, they'd broken it thousands of times, almost 3 times per day. And so here we are, at the dawn of 2026, and Lebanon remains a country destroyed. It's an economy still in tatters with a war that never seems to end. But this country is a phoenix. Over the last 10,000 years, it has risen and fallen and risen again. Though their blood might run purple, though the image of their martyrs might forever hang above their heads, this has always been a nation of silver linings. And for everything that's happened, for all the horrors of the past, the present, and no doubt the future, even after those 10,000 years, the most enviable part of Lebanon has never been destroyed. In the 150 countries I have visited, no group of people have ever been friendlier to me than the Lebanese. They invited me into their homes, they fed me when they barely had enough for themselves, and if I walked past a store, no matter how evident that business's struggles might have been, they would rush out to give me something as a gift. The people of this country had no desire beyond seeing me happy in their land, and they are what make their country great.
And so, well, it pains me to say that as we enter 2026, the people of Lebanon are still being forced to live in the ashes of their nation. It is from those ashes where they have always been born. Lebanon is a phoenix, and I truly hope that this is the year we get to see those wings. This is Rare Earth. Thanks for watching, everybody.